Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where curiosity slows its breathing, where science strolls instead of sprints, and where large, unwieldy ideas are allowed to stretch out and lie still for a while, the way thoughts sometimes do, right before sleep. This is a space for wondering without a deadline, for asking questions that don't insist on quick replies, and for letting the mind wander through deep time at a pace that feels kind to your nervous system. Tonight, we're going to linger with a thought that feels both ancient and strangely personal, a question rooted not only in geology and history, but in imagination itself. Picture a world before maps needed lines, before oceans carved the planet into recognizable pieces, before words like Africa, Europe, or the Americas had ever been spoken. Imagine standing on ground that does not give way to a shoreline after a few days of walking, but continues, calmly and without hurry, in every direction. A single sweeping surface stitched together by rock instead of separated by water. A world that lived and ended long before human memory, yet still lies under us in scattered remnants. What if the first civilization arose on Pangaea? Not as a metaphor, not as legend, at least not at first, but as a quiet possibility to consider carefully, without rushing toward a verdict. What if the earliest organized human culture, the first shared customs, the first truly long memories, took form on a planet where all the continents were fused into one? One landmass, one continuous world. It's a thought that can feel almost too big at the beginning, like trying to cup the entire globe between your hands. But in this moment, we're not here to prove it or dismiss it. We're here to explore what it would mean, how a world like that might shape people, movement, stories, survival, and the soft, nearly invisible habits of everyday life. We're here to let the question unfold slowly, layer after layer, the way the Earth's crust once did. Before we go further, pause for a moment and notice where you are right now. Where are you listening from this evening or this morning? Is it late at night or very early in the day? Is the world outside your window resting or in motion? Somewhere on this planet, the sun is lifting itself over land that once pressed tightly against a different continent now far away. Somewhere else, it is sinking. All of us, separated now by seas and channels, are sharing a moment of attention across ground that has been drifting for ages. If spending time with questions like this feels calming to you, or if you enjoy hearing science and imagination meet in a quieter, slower space, you're always welcome to like this, follow along, or subscribe. It helps this small pocket of stillness find others who might be searching for something gentle to listen to as the day lets go. But for now, there's nothing you have to do. Just listen. Let's start by steadying ourselves in what Pangaea actually was. Not as the dramatic classroom diagram of a supercontinent, but as a long, sustained chapter in Earth's biography. Pangaea was not a brief geological accident. It existed for roughly 160 million years, from about 335 to 175 million years ago, forming slowly as older pieces of crust collided, locked together, and refused to part. For tens of millions of years, nearly all dry land was joined into a mostly unified whole, ringed by a single immense global ocean called Pangaea. From orbit, if anyone had been watching from that height, the planet would have looked unfamiliar and yet complete, like a puzzle pressed fully together instead of scattered across a table. There's something we should say clearly and early. Modern humans did not walk on Pangaea. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared only about 300,000 years ago, unimaginably long after the supercontinent had already fractured into wandering pieces. Dinosaurs roamed Pangaea. Early mammals kept low in its shadows. Forests grew and vanished. Deserts advanced and retreated. Inland seas appeared and then dried away. But humans, in anything like the form we recognize, arrived on a very different world. So why ask this question at all? Because Earth's surface remembers. Because continents drift at a speed that feels glacial to us, but not so slowly that nothing stays connected. Because fragments of Pangaea lingered long after the official breakup. Land bridges rose and sank. Climate patterns held on like faint after-images. Mountain belts and fault lines carried structural echoes of older arrangements. And because early human civilization is still threaded with mysteries, gaps and silences where we can feel that stories should exist but no longer do. The earliest known civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, early dynastic China, ancient Egypt step into the archaeological record already intricate. They appear with established agriculture, architecture, astronomy, systems of writing or proto-writing, and complex social organization. That doesn't mean they emerged from nowhere. It hints at long, deep periods of development we can only reconstruct in outline. So the question softens, becomes more precise. What if the roots of civilization, not cities or scripts yet, but shared behaviors, persistent traditions, and ways of organizing daily life, began in a world that was less divided than our own? A world where land travel did not slam into coastlines and stop. A world where migration could follow open plains and river corridors without being severed by deep salt water. A world where cultural ideas drifted not by sail at first, but on foot. Picture early humans, or even the pre-human ancestors who came before them, living on a planet where you could, in principle, keep walking almost indefinitely without ever needing to cross an ocean. Not comfortably, not easily, but continuously. Lineages could migrate slowly across thousands of kilometers, generation after generation, without ever meeting water wider than a river or a lake, without ever facing that pure psychological edge of an endless moving horizon of waves. In such a world, isolation would be defined differently. Cultures would still specialize and drift apart. Climates would still sort behavior into local patterns, but the feeling of being cut off absolutely would be rarer. Knowledge could seep outward across land. Technologies once stumbled upon might spread farther before being forgotten. Myths could branch and transform but remain recognizable cousins across tremendous distance. This is not the same as claiming a continent-spanning civilization with glittering cities ran across Pangaea from coast to coast. Instead, it's an invitation to consider how the layout of the planet sets the stage for what humans can become. Geography is not just backdrop. It is an active force in the story. Mountain ranges bend movement. Rivers invite settlement. Oceans slice narratives apart. On Pangaea, the rules would have been written differently. The interior of that supercontinent was likely harsh and extreme. Far from the temperature-softening presence of the sea, some regions swung between punishing heat and bitter cold. Many of those inland zones received very little rain, forming enormous deserts and semi-arid belts that could stretch for thousands of kilometers. Life would have concentrated around coastlines, major rivers, and inland seas, the places where water, and therefore possibility, persisted. If intelligent beings had lived there at any stage, they would have learned quickly that movement was not optional. It was survival. Knowing when to go, when to stay, and how to read subtle signals from sky, soil, wind, plants, and animals would have been as important as knowing how to build shelter. Seasonal migration may have been a way of life long before planting took hold. Groups could follow shifting bands of climate, herds of animals, and changing vegetation across huge distances of connected land. Over time, those movement patterns could harden into tradition. Journeys themselves would become the central reference points, stories tied not to single sacred sites, but to loops and routes. Rivers crossed, passes climbed, valleys where the herds always turned. Knowledge would be carried along paths rather than locked into permanent structures. Instead of roads to cities, you would have remembered trails to seasons. This kind of existence leaves a light trace in the physical record. Highly mobile cultures, especially very ancient ones, rarely build things that endure for tens of thousands of years. No towering walls, no stone pyramids, few carved monuments. Their archives live in tools, in campfire charcoal, in bones, and most of all, in oral tradition and repeated movement. When continents later shear apart and oceans spread between their fragments, those movement patterns shatter. Stories that once flowed into one another begin to diverge more sharply. Technologies meet new constraints. Shared origins blur, then fade. It's worth pausing on how many ancient cultures now divided by oceans hold strikingly similar motifs. Floods that reset the world, sky beings and storm gods, serpents or dragons coiled around the edges of creation, pillar trees, cosmic mountains, underworld rivers. These common themes are often explained through shared human psychology, which is real and powerful. Independent invention certainly plays a role, but the shape of the land matters too. When terrain is continuous, people and their stories can move together. Even language itself is pulled by geography. Linguistic families fan out across space in ways that suggest long, slow spread rather than sudden, disconnected jumps. A unified landmass would strengthen that pattern. Dialects might drift gradually as you walk, shading into one another over distance, instead of breaking sharply at coastlines or mountain barriers. On Pangaea, you could almost imagine hearing speech change like a sliding scale, not a set of broken steps. As Pangaea began to rupture first in hairline fractures, then in widening rifts that would one day become seas, these slow gradients would snap. Populations linked by valleys, plains, and river systems would watch those routes drown or collapse. Some would learn to cross by raft or boat. Others would turn back. Others would never know that a crossing was once possible. With time, isolation would deepen. Cultures would crystallize into distinct shapes. Technologies would reinvent and diverge. The faint memory of once having been joined would slip from history into legend, and from legend into silence. Seen this way, the breakup of Pangaea is not only a geological episode, it's a narrative hinge, a quiet pivot point in the background conditions of human possibility, a moment when what humanity could become narrowed into more separated, more local, more fragmented paths. Not worse paths, just different ones. Think about how differently history unfolds on an island versus a vast continent. Isolation tends to produce unique, tightly adapted cultures and vulnerability to outside shocks. Broad, connected land encourages exchange, blending, cross-pollination, and also conflict on a wide scale. A supercontinent nudges the balance far toward continuity. Long, slow arcs of cultural inheritance, fewer clean breaks. It's also possible that early hominins' ancestors and cousins of modern humans experienced the last lingering ghost of a more connected world. Pangaea itself was gone by then, but its children Gondwana and Laurasia still shaped global circulation. Land bridges such as Beringia linked continents during ice ages. Lower sea levels exposed routes that are now seafloor. Even within the timeline we consider recent, Earth was substantially more walkable than it is at present. From that perspective, the idea of a first civilization on Pangaea stops being about strict dates and becomes more about mindset. Civilization not as a fixed location on a map, but as a process, a gradual weaving together of shared habits, cooperative strategies, and adaptive knowledge, developing in a world that invited motion instead of confinement. As continents pulled apart and seas rose into the rifts between them, those habits would have been forced to adapt. Agriculture becomes appealing when wandering becomes harder. Permanent settlements grow attractive when the cost of leaving rises. Writing becomes useful when face-to-face exchange can no longer stitch far-flung knowledge together. In a way, borders begin not with fences or treaties, but with shorelines. So when we ask, what if the first civilization lived on Pangaea? We're also asking something gentler underneath. Who are we when the world is open? How do we behave when nothing in the landscape insists on keeping us separate? What do we remember, and what do we allow ourselves to lose when the ground beneath us chooses to move on? Long before coastlines learned to bow away from each other, before oceans practiced the art of division, the continents existed in another mood altogether. Not dramatic, not restlessly shuffling their edges into today's atlas shapes, but settled into a long, quiet pose that outlasted anything humans have yet built. When all lands were one, Earth was not hurrying. It was simply continuing, under skies that did not yet recognize the boundaries we now draw. Pangaea was not a frozen instant. It was a condition, a long arrangement in Earth's deep story where land met land almost everywhere. Mountain chains thrust upward where plates collided, immense lowlands spread across the interior. A single, looping coastline wrapped around the outside like a continuous rim on a single bowl. If you could have walked across that world, you would not have crossed countries or maritime borders. You would have crossed climates, altitudes, and ecosystems, but always on the same joined crust, rock remembering rock. That stability matters. When geography holds its general shape for tens of millions of years, patterns get the chance to sink in. Rivers carve deeper paths. Winds find their favorite routes. Life settles into long negotiations with place. When continents don't constantly collide or fragment, relationships between organisms and landscapes grow more intricate. You can almost imagine a slow conversation between Earth and the things that live on it, both sides learning each other's habits. The interior of Pangaea was enormous, larger than any continuous land region today. Far from the buffering touch of the ocean, its climate was fierce in ways we would find unfamiliar. Summers could sear. Winters could strip heat frighteningly fast. Rain was scarce or intermittent over vast areas, building deserts that might stretch beyond any horizon you had seen before. These places weren't empty, but they demanded patience and a close reading of subtle signs. Closer to the supercontinent's edges, things softened. Coastal belts felt the ocean's tempering hand. Temperatures swung less wildly. Rain came more consistently. Forests thickened in some zones. Inland seas themselves, born of earlier geologic drama, drew life toward them, acting like veins running through the stone. A still world is not a silent world. It's a world with fewer abrupt shocks, fewer surprise collisions, fewer islands snapping into being overnight. Change still happens, but on a tempo that allows more creatures to stay and adapt instead of flee. Extinctions come, but so do long intervals where ecosystems can mature instead of constantly reboot. If we place hypothetical early hominins into this setting, their sense of Earth would be very different from ours. Not smaller, but differently vast. Distance would not be a line broken by shore. It would be measured in effort, in supplies, in memory. A journey would not stop because the land ran out. It would stop because the body did, or the food did, or the climate ahead no longer forgave mistakes. A world like that teaches long-distance familiarity. Trails become family property, not in the legal sense, but in the mnemonic one. Valleys gain personalities. Mountain silhouettes become old companions. Stories would most likely grow outward rather than root themselves in a single spot. Instead of myths anchored to one holy peak or one central city, you might tell stories that unwind along a route. This pass, that river bend, this wintering plain. The calm of such a world is also written in stone. Without frequent reorganization of the continents, rock layers can compile their histories in thick, legible stacks. Fossils find time to accumulate. Cause and effect leave clearer markers. For geologists today, Pangaea is like a well-organized archive compared to the shredded, scattered paper of more chaotic times. The same logic would apply to cultures. Skills could be refined steadily instead of being lost and rediscovered in isolation. Tool-making styles might persist, evolving slowly instead of splitting into completely separate lineages. Knowledge of animals, plants, seasons, and places could stretch across enormous areas, smeared out not by conquest, but by gentle, consistent movement and shared ancestry. Silence in this sense isn't the absence of noise, it's the absence of interruption. Oceans are interruptions. They are edges that demand new strategies. To cross them, you must decide to leave what you know and enter something that operates under different rules. Pangaea, for a long time, offered fewer of those discontinuities. Rivers block and invite at once. Mountains deny and guide. Deserts warn but do not forbid. The land speaks in gradients. Fewer walls, more slopes. That shapes how beings understand space. Instead of thinking in paired opposites here versus there, old world versus new world, You might think in terms of nearer and farther, higher and lower, wetter and drier. Navigation becomes about reading the environment rather than decoding abstract charts. Memory stands in for maps, stories stand in for signposts. A quieter planet also slows the turnover of culture. When groups remain loosely connected across broad distances, innovations can smear across that space. There is less pressure to grow completely distinct simply to stand out. Cultural drift still happens, but it looks more like a fading accent than a hard language barrier. Over long stretches of time, you get something like a patchwork of local flavors laid over a shared base. It's essential, though, not to confuse quiet with peace. That world would still have its predators, its conflicts, its scarcity and shocks. But tension would play out within a shared ecological stage rather than between isolated theaters. One solution would often be to walk away. Migration could be a pressure valve instead of a risky leap into the unknown. Under Pangaea's sky, the stars would look much like they do now, but their social meaning might be enlarged. Without sea-slicing observers into distinct maritime cultures, star patterns could anchor shared seasons across huge spans of land. The same rising of a certain constellation could signal planting time or migration time for people who would never meet, yet were still faintly in step. In that sense, a unified land encourages a more communal sense of time. When sunrise, rain cycles, and seasonal shifts slide across continuous space, coordination becomes easier, even without planning. If agriculture ever did emerge in such a setting, it would likely spread along climate bands instead of having to jump watery gaps. Herding practices would echo one another across zones. Ceremonies could synchronize loosely over long distances. Even before farming, hunter-gatherer life depends on timing. Animals, seeds, roots, fruit, and water all come and go. On a joined world, those signals cascade in more predictable, connected ways. A lesson learned in one latitude might apply, with small edits, far away. The sky, the land, and the calendar would all be part of the same woven system. Pangaea's quiet also lies in its reluctance to surprise on a continental scale. Earthquakes struck, volcanoes burned, but the wild tectonic collisions of forming or tearing supercontinents had mostly already played out or were still gathering. For a while, the background assumption that tomorrow's ground would look like today's was mostly correct. Psychologically, that matters. It becomes reasonable to invest in deeply learned paths and traditions when the map isn't constantly redrawn. Over millions of years, life responded to that stability by spreading wide. Large animals ranged across immense territories. Plants evolved strategies for long-distance dispersal. Biomes bled into one another more gradually, like colors in a wash, rather than standing apart as isolated patches. The biosphere was a network before it was a set of separated laboratories. When we imagine a first civilization against this backdrop, it stops being about skyscrapers and stonework and becomes about continuity. Civilization is a shared way of making sense of the world, not yet carved into monuments, but carried in expectations, in assumptions about how people behave and what the land will allow. Eventually, Pangaea's quiet began to fray. Deep below, heat pooled under the thick continent. Mantle currents shifted their grip. The heavy slab of joined crust acted like a blanket, trapping warmth, letting stress build along old hidden seams. Cracks formed like hairline fractures in cooling glass. Rifts deepened, valleys sagged. Water moved in to explore these new scars. At first, none of this would have looked world-ending from the surface. A river grows wider here. A low basin holds water longer there. Marshes creep into what used to be solid ground. Generations might pass before anyone noticed that a trusted route was now slower, soggier, riskier. Great transformations often begin under the cover of small annoyances. As Pangaea began, very slowly, to relax its grip on itself, its once seamless surface introduced detours. The land was still one piece, but you now had to choose more carefully how to move across it. Turn back, push through, or stay put a bit longer. Each choice nudged traditions in new directions. Over many lifetimes, those choices would accumulate. In those subtle beginnings of drift, the seeds of later, more familiar civilizations may have been planted. When walking becomes harder, memory becomes more precious. When old paths close, specific places acquire deeper meaning. When separation appears for the first time, identity sharpens. But in that earlier era, when all lands were still, in a fundamental sense, one Earth offered something we no longer experience directly: openness as a default setting, continuity as the quiet background condition, a planet-sized invitation to see how far connection alone could carry us before the ground itself decided to pull away. To imagine humanity before the continents drifted apart, it helps to set down the map you're used to carrying in your head, the one where blue fills the gaps, where solid edges mark where you have to stop or build a boat, where distance feels final because water says so. Instead, picture a surface that simply keeps going, where your limits are time, weather, and the durability of your body rather than the hard line of a shore. This isn't about placing modern humans in the wrong chapter of Earth's history. It's about exploring how intelligence, cooperation, and shared behavior might unfold on a planet that hasn't yet learned to break itself into separate stages. At the core, what we call humanity is less about buildings and alphabets, and more about patterns. Patterns of movement, patterns of working together, patterns of remembering and teaching, so that each generation does not have to start from zero. Those patterns begin long before cities. They begin wherever beings rely on one another, plan beyond the next few hours, and treat knowledge as something worth carrying forward. A connected world rewrites how those patterns are shaped. On a land without oceans interrupting it, early human ancestors would not experience Earth as a row of disconnected regions. They would experience it as a continuum. The ground would lift gradually instead of stopping. The air would dry out slowly instead of snapping into desert or forest with no warning. Animals would change shape and behavior across distance, but without that abrupt sense of crossing from one world into another. There would be no cliff labeled end of land, just a steady drift of conditions. Identity in such a world would likely be less about coordinates and more about practice. Less, we are from this exact place, and more, we live this way. We move with these seasons. We hunt and gather like this. We cooperate like that. Groups would still define themselves, but the definitions would be softer at the edges. Contact would be common enough that sharp lines between us and them wouldn't hold as tightly. Even when groups diverged, the separation would be slow and layered. People would still know someone who knew someone from a neighboring way of life. Differences might be large in detail, yet familiar in logic. You might not share all the same customs, but you would understand why the other group lives as it does. That feeling of familiarity would change how you reacted to strangers. Meeting people you didn't know would not be rare or automatically threatening. It would be an expected recurring event along long routes. Over time, that expectation would sculpt social instincts. It would reward communication, adaptation, and the ability to read unfamiliar signals. It would make cooperation across group boundaries not just a virtue, but a survival trait. Language is one of the clearest mirrors of this. In a world chopped into pieces by water, languages fork, isolate, and sometimes cut off completely. In a world held together by land, speech can slide and blur instead. Dialects might shade from one into another as you walk, new words appearing, old ones fading, sounds shifting. But mutual understanding would linger for longer distances because the breakpoints are fewer and softer. That doesn't create a single universal tongue. It creates a web of related ways of speaking, with smooth transitions rather than sharp breaks. A traveler going far from their birthplace might notice that each camp sounds a little different, like hearing accents change as you drive across several modern states. But basic meaning could still be pieced together, especially with hands, facial expression, and shared tasks filling in the gaps. Movement itself would sit at the center of life, not as random wandering, but as structured response. When food moves, you move. When water withdraws, you adjust your path. When a season arrives, you head toward where it has always meant safety. Knowledge embeds itself in these motions. Knowing when to leave is as valuable as knowing where you're going. Children would grow up not just learning places, but learning paths. Paths would be more than lines on the ground. They would be living memory tracks, encoding timing, sources of water, safe crossings, danger zones, plant cycles, and agreements with other groups. One tale about a journey might double as a map, a weather almanac, and a survival manual all at once. In a continuous world, these paths could stretch across enormous distances, not as a single heroic trek, but as a chain. Each group would know their segment in detail, then pass travelers along. No central authority would be required to keep the whole thing coherent. Continuity would come from repetition and shared interest. Here, civilization in its earliest sense stops being about walls and monuments and starts being about expectation. About the quiet assumption that knowledge will be preserved, that the skills you learn matter to people you haven't met yet, that cooperation extends beyond blood ties. Those assumptions don't require stone streets. They require relatively stable conditions and relatively open routes, both of which a supercontinent can supply. Think about tools in this setting. A useful change, sharper edges, better bindings, a more efficient way to strike sparks. Doesn't stay boxed in one valley. It travels with anyone who uses it, then with those who watch and copy. Over time, it becomes the unremarkable standard across a broad swath of land, tweaked for local materials but recognizable everywhere. That spread cuts down on wasted effort. Fewer groups need to reinvent the same thing from scratch. Instead of losing solutions in pockets and rediscovering them later, the human lineage can refine, slowly but steadily. A stone point that once chipped easily becomes more durable. A fire-starting technique once reliable only in dry weather becomes more adaptable. No one planned this globally, yet a large-scale pattern emerges. The same applies beyond tools. Child-rearing habits, conflict resolution, sharing rules, ways of handling grief or celebration. These social technologies can also spread when routes are open. When something works well in one context, it can be echoed elsewhere with adjustments. Over long spans of time, this process can create a loose, continent-scale coherence in behavior. Not uniform, but legible. You could walk very far and still recognize the rhythm of a meal, the structure of a story, the logic of generosity. Scale itself would feel different. In a world hemmed in by water, far away has a clear ceiling. You can only go so far before the map says stop. In a unified world, far away has no obvious built-in boundary. It's limited by rumor, memory, and the outer reach of paths, not by a final wall of water. The world feels open-ended. There's always more, just beyond what you've heard. That openness favors a certain kind of curiosity, not reckless, but persistent. The unknown is no longer an absolute void. It's merely a place you haven't seen yet, governed by the same gravity, same sky, same kinds of plants and animals in new mixes. Oceans, by contrast, demand a conceptual leap. You must first conceive of moving through a medium you can't breathe, on something that floats, toward a horizon that offers no visual promise of land. Pangaea delays that mental leap. Without oceans forcing solutions, some technologies simply become less urgent. Complex watercraft, open ocean navigation, and long-distance maritime trade might arrive much later, or along narrower coastal strips. Human creativity doesn't shrink in that scenario. It simply channels itself into other problems, carrying more over land, reading landscapes more precisely, managing large territories on foot, deepening knowledge of weather on ground rather than at sea. Architecture might grow more slowly. Astronomy might grow faster. Animals might be domesticated differently. We can't know the exact balance, but we can see the general rule. The environment nudges invention. Under one sky over one land, the stars become a particularly powerful shared reference. The same patterns, Orion-like hunters, great animal shapes, bright anchors near the poles would look down on journeys and camps across the entire supercontinent with only gradual shifts. Star-based timekeeping would tie together distant lives. Planting, following herds, deciding when to start or end a long move, all could be coordinated against the same celestial clock. That common clock would help build a sense of belonging that reaches beyond immediate neighbors, not as nationalism, but as a felt recognition that others elsewhere are living out their own cycles under the same lights. The idea of people we will never meet, but who share our seasons, would take root. As the land eventually began to stretch apart, that shared openness would be tested. Paths would break at water's edge. Familiar circuits would dead end in bays and gulfs. Messages would take longer to travel. Practices once spread easily would begin to mutate in isolation. Identities would harden. Languages would branch. Technologies would fork, meeting different constraints. But before that tightening, there would have been a long prelude, a phase in which connection was cheap and separation was rare. In that prelude, deeply human behaviors, empathy for strangers, interest in how others live, the ability to coordinate across group boundaries would have had rich soil to grow in. When strangers are a regular part of life rather than a rare shock, social intelligence becomes as necessary as sharp tools. Trust would not be naive. It would be practiced. People would develop subtle ways to signal intentions, negotiate access, and decide whether to share routes or information. Rituals, greeting customs, exchanges of gifts or stories, all the soft technologies of peace would evolve as everyday tools, not as occasional ceremonies. Later civilizations would formalize some of these behaviors, but their roots might stretch back into that earlier, more connected world. Even conflict would feel different. On a landmass where retreat is always an option, direct confrontation is not the only way to solve a problem. Groups can thin out their overlap. They can move along different paths. Violence would exist, but so would the option of simply leaving. This doesn't erase war, but it shifts its role. The ability to find or negotiate space becomes as important as the ability to hold it. The human body itself likely carries marks of this kind of world. Endurance walking across varied conditions rewards efficient feet, cooling mechanisms like sweating, flexible diets that can handle sudden shifts in what's available. These are exactly the traits we see in our species. Long stride, remarkable stamina, heat tolerance, omnivory. It's not that Pangaea shaped modern humans directly, but a connected, walkable Earth favors the same kinds of solutions. Memory, too, would be different. When survival leans heavily on recalling roots, seasons, and far-flung relationships, memory becomes spatial and narrative at once. Stories are not only about heroes and spirits, they are living databases. A tale that winds through different valleys or lists the trials of a legendary journey is also a compressed record of what to expect and where to go. Over generations, oral tradition becomes astonishingly precise. We can see echoes of this today in indigenous cultures whose stories encode volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, or coastline changes that occurred thousands of years ago. In a more continuous world, these traditions might stretch across even larger areas, tying people in different regions together with shared reference points in story rather than in stone. When writing eventually appears, it may do so less as a sudden step forward and more as a rescue mission. As seas rise and land pulls away, memory supported by movement begins to falter. Roots cannot be walked as easily. Stories lose some of their living anchors in the terrain. Writing becomes a way to freeze knowledge that can no longer rely on regular face-to-face renewal. It turns moving wisdom into something portable across broken space. So imagining humanity before the continents drifted apart is not really about hidden empires buried under dinosaur bones. It's about a long, slow rehearsal. A species learning how to cooperate, remember, adapt, and move under conditions that made connection the default rather than the challenge. That perspective doesn't fight what archaeology shows us. It fills in emotional and social texture that artifacts alone can't reveal. Flint flakes and hearth ash tell us what people did. A connected world helps us guess how it felt to live that way. As the ground eventually began to tear itself into separate rafts, that early, fluid humanity didn't vanish. It branched. Some groups grew isolated. Some invented new solutions. Some memories congealed into myth. The soft continuity of the unified world faded into a more jagged, bounded reality. But habits learned in openness did not disappear. They echoed in recurring symbols, in story structures that reappear across oceans, in our persistent ability to see ourselves in strangers. The continents drifted, but the species that walked on them carried forward a quiet sense, so faint we rarely name it, that separation is not the most natural arrangement. That once, very long ago in a way we can't quite remember, distance meant only how far you were willing or able to walk. To understand what Pangaea might have looked and felt like beneath ancient skies, it helps to strip away the default colors and borders that modern maps have taught you to expect. No tidy blue shapes hugging familiar outlines. No instantly recognizable silhouettes of continents. Instead, imagine a single vast plate of land occupying much of one hemisphere, wrapped almost completely by one uninterrupted ocean. The sky above that land would feel large in a different way than it does to us. Not because the world was emptier, but because the ground did not give you many obvious endings. The horizon would not promise a shoreline just over its curve. It would offer only more land dry, forested, mountainous, flooded, but always connected. Pangaea was not flat, gentle, or uniform. It was a place of sharp contrasts, formed by plates that had been grinding together, overriding one another, and then locking into place for ages. At its center lay enormous continental interiors set far from any moderating sea. These inland realms were pushed to climatic extremes that are hard to find in a single continuous stretch today. Without nearby water to smooth the seasons, summers in many of these regions could turn fiercely hot, baking exposed surfaces and wringing moisture from soil and air. Winters, when they came, could swing the other way, bringing bone-dry cold that stole warmth quickly as the sun slipped down. Air masses moved over huge distances without picking up much humidity, so clouds and rain arrived unevenly. Long sequences of dry days would be interrupted by violent, short-lived storms. Rivers in such a setting would be moody companions. Some would run reliably from wetter margins toward drier hearts, but many would pulse with the seasons, surging into power when rains came, then shrinking or vanishing into sand and gravel beds when they did not. When they flooded, they carved broad channels and left behind temporary floodplains, briefly green, then back to dust. Nearer the coasts, the sky's behavior softened. The immense ocean that ringed Pangaea gave its edge zones a kind of breathing rhythm missing from the interior. Sea breezes tempered heat. Moisture-laden winds climbed inland, fell as more regular rain, and fed thick vegetation. Swampy lowlands and coastal wetlands formed wherever gentle slopes allowed standing water. In some places you might have seen tidal flats, in others mangrove-style forests clinging to shallow, warm shores. Above everything, the sky followed patterns that would feel at once familiar and slightly off. The sun still climbed and set in arcs. The moon still cycled through its phases, tugging at tides and subtly affecting air and water. The stars still wheeled in slow, nightly rotation, but the exact routes they traced across the sky and the points on the horizon where they rose and set reflected continental positions that no longer exist. With no human-made light to dull them, the stars over Pangaea would have been overwhelming. The Milky Way would tear across the blackness as a bright, textured river of light. On clear, dry nights, it might have been bright enough to cast the faintest of shadows. To any eyes capable of perception, the night sky would have been not an empty dome, but an intricate, repeating map. For any intelligent beings living under that sky, paying attention upward would not have been an esoteric interest. It would have been everyday practicality. When you lack fixed road networks and permanent artificial light, the heavens become the most stable guide you have. Knowing which stars mark the cold season, which signal rains, and which can be trusted as direction anchors could mean the difference between arriving and getting lost. The land itself wore the marks of a long, forceful assembly. Where plates had collided to build Pangaea, giant mountain chains rose, some rivaling or exceeding the scale of modern ranges, others already eroding into older, rounder masses. Some of today's mountain belts, like the Appalachians, are the worn-down remnants of these Pangaean giants, now split and scattered by later rifting. Those mountains shaped wind and water, creating alternating belts of wet and dry. One side might host dense forests and steady streams, while the other lay in deep rain shadow, building deserts and open scrub. Between ranges, high plateaus and long plains spread out, their character changing with subtle shifts in elevation and rock type. These plains were not endless monotone grass fields. They were mosaics. In some places, grasses would dominate. In others, shrubs and hardy trees. Soil chemistry, past flooding, volcanic ash, and wind-blown dust would all leave their fingerprints on what could grow where. Life that survived here did so by tuning itself to patterns, rare rains, predictable winds, seasonal migrations. Volcanoes added their own punctuation marks. Along rift zones where Pangaea was gradually stretching, magma found its way to the surface. Lava flows blanketed old ground. Ash clouds shaded sunlight and fertilized distant regions with fine minerals. These zones, dangerous in the short term, could become biological hotspots in the long term, as young, nutrient-rich rock weathered into fertile soil. The atmosphere itself, in different slices of Pangaea's history, carried different balances of gases than we know now. In some intervals, oxygen was higher, supporting larger animals in different fire regimes. Carbon dioxide levels, often elevated, contributed to warmer global climates in certain eras. Those greenhouse conditions helped shape where deserts formed, how far forests spread, and how strong storms became. With so much land in one block, wind systems could build and travel over tremendous distances. Monsoon-like patterns could have developed where seasonal heating drew moist air tens or hundreds of kilometers inland, then released it as bursts of rain. Elsewhere, dry, dusty winds would have scoured surfaces, lifting fine particles high into the air, creating dust veils that crossed half a continent and filtered the sun's light. For life below, adaptability wasn't a luxury. It was the baseline requirement. Plants evolved strategies to survive long dry intervals, store water, shed leaves, or root deeply. Some cast seeds that could lie dormant until just the right pulse of moisture arrived. Animals tuned their lives to these rhythms, migrating, burrowing, or timing reproduction to the brief windows when the world softened. If early human ancestors or other intelligent lineages had watched these skies, their sense of place would have been inseparable from what they saw above. On open plains where the land did not provide many tall markers, the sun's arc, the moon's position, and the turning of star patterns would serve as invisible signposts. You would carry the map in your mind, anchored to the vault of the sky. Daylight on many parts of Pangaea would have been harsh and unfiltered, especially in sparse interiors with a limited tree cover. Shade would be precious. Activity patterns would tilt toward dawn and dusk, with midday reserved for rest, shelter, and tasks that could be done out of direct sun. That daily rhythm work in softness, pause in intensity, still shapes many traditional lifeways in hot regions today. Night would bring a different kind of intensity. Temperatures might drop fast under clear skies, making warmth a new concern. Sound would travel efficiently across open terrain. The calls of animals, rustling plants, and the quiet crackle of distant events would reach far. Predators might move more freely. Fire, in that darkness, would become not just heat and cooking, but a protective boundary and a social center. The glow of campfires scattered across Pangaea's nights would have looked, from above, like human-made constellations mirroring the sky. Seasonal swings in many areas would be sharp. Without oceans to buffer transitions, the shift from wet to dry or warm to cold could change a landscape's feel quickly. For beings living there, sensing these switches early would be vital. Slight changes in the angle of light, the behavior of particular birds or insects, the smell of moisture or dust in the air, these cues would form part of a shared sensory vocabulary. Over time, that vocabulary would become culture. Certain cloud shapes would carry widely understood implications. The appearance of a particular flower or the first call of a migratory bird could mark calendar points more reliably than any human-made clock. Stories would encode this knowledge, not as dry instruction, but as memorable tales about why it matters that the sky looks a certain way on a certain evening. The sheer scale of Pangaea would also affect sound, silence, and spacing. In open, sparsely vegetated regions, sound could carry impressive distances, forcing groups to think carefully about noise. Hunting, hiding, and even social gatherings would take into account how far voices might travel. Communities might space themselves based on hearing range as well as resource availability. The horizon, in such a setting, becomes a character in daily life. Always present, always at the same reachable yet unreachable distance. It reminds you how small you are in relation to the land, but also how continuous that land is. There's no line where it suddenly stops, just a bending arc where light fades. Cloud systems over a single connected landmass can grow large and coherent. Storm fronts could stretch for hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Seeing dark shapes building on the far edge of your world might tell you about weather that would arrive days later. The sky would not only reflect your immediate surroundings, it would hint at what was coming from far away. Color, too, would leave its impressions. Different rock and soil types, different plant communities, and different air compositions would paint Pangaea in a wide palette. Some deserts might glow red or orange, others pale and chalky. Forests might look deep, nearly black-green from a distance. Dust in the atmosphere would shift sunrise and sunset into extended displays of reds, violets, and golds. For any reflective beings watching those displays, the sky would invite interpretation, not as idle abstraction, but as guidance. The sky says move, rest, prepare, wait. Over time, that guidance would be personified. Lightning, storm tracks, eclipses, and rare events would collect stories around them, becoming more than just weather. They would become part of how the world is explained to children. As Pangaea aged, its skies would evolve. Slow shifts in plate position would alter latitudes and climates. New rifts would let moisture penetrate farther inland. Expanding or contracting inland seas would change where monsoons formed and where deserts hardened. Winds would reorganize. Regions that had known dry reliability might begin to feel more humid. Others might lose their rains as mountains rose or fell. For populations living through these slow turns, the changes would be noticeable only when memory reached far enough back. An elder might recall that winters used to be shorter, that a certain hillside stayed green longer, that a river froze more often. Younger generations, raised under slightly different skies, might take new patterns as normal. Stories would bridge that gap, capturing shifts that individual lifespans could not. Eventually, as rifts deepened into proto-oceans and coastlines redefined themselves, the skies over certain regions would begin to resemble something closer to what we know now, more maritime on some edges, more isolated elsewhere. But before that, Pangaea beneath ancient skies was a place where land invited continuity, and the heavens offered a shared, dependable frame for understanding. A world where life learned, again and again, that the sky was not separate from survival, but one of its primary languages. That particular arrangement of land and sky no longer exists, yet its influence persists in ways that are easy to miss. In the way continents still echo each other's outlines across oceans, in the way people everywhere look up and build meaning from repeated celestial patterns, and in the lingering sense that, long before the world fractured into separate pieces, there was once a single roof of stars arching over a single continuous ground. The question of whether early humans, or their close relatives, could have walked the world from one end to the other sounds at first like a poetic exaggeration, an image built for bedtime stories. But if you slow that image down and look at it closely, it becomes less like fantasy and more like a quiet, logistical possibility. Not because anyone set out to circumnavigate the planet as a single project, but because walking, repeated over long enough spans of time and generations, is very good at filling space. Early humans did not experience distance in the same way we do now. There were no printed maps labeling continents, no solid blue spaces marking travel as impossible, no mental categories that said, "Beyond here, you need a ship." Movement was framed not as intentional exploration, but as response. Follow the herds, follow the rains, follow the river upstream when downstream dries. Each decision might only add a small stretch of ground. Each life might witness only modest shifts. But those shifts stack. In a connected landmass, there is no single moment where someone decides to go very far. There's only the next valley that looks slightly better, the next ridge rumored to hold fewer predators, the next cluster of trees that might offer shade and fruit. Over centuries, those local choices trace arcs that, in hindsight, look enormous. We already know humans can do this, even in a broken world. Homo sapiens spread from Africa to nearly every habitable region of the globe in a geologically brief window. People crossed deserts, mountains, and eventually entire oceans, often with technologies that, by modern standards, seem fragile. This expansion wasn't driven primarily by conquest or idle curiosity. It came from adaptation and persistence. You move because staying still stops working. On a unified landmass, the expansion would encounter fewer absolute dead ends. The edges that do exist would be climatic, not continental. No sheer line of water forcing you to invent boats before proceeding. No sudden end to familiar physics of walking. Migration becomes a nearly continuous fabric rather than a patchwork of jumps and pauses. Paths can bend, loop, and overlap without hitting a final wall. It's important to remember that humans do not move as isolated figures crossing empty maps. They move in groups, families, bands, extended kin webs. They carry children, tools, memories, stories about past places, stories about dangers and blessings. Movement becomes a social act, not just a physical one. Every decision about direction is embedded in relationships. When one group enters a new region, it does not erase whoever is already there. Sometimes it joins them. Sometimes it merges and interbreeds. Sometimes it observes, learns, trades, and continues on. In other cases, it turns away. The result is not a neat wave of population pushing forward like a clean line. It is a layered presence, a palimpsest of arrivals, retreats, overlaps, and quiet extinctions across the same ground. Walking the world end to end doesn't require one person to complete a heroic circuit. It only requires that there be no insurmountable physical barrier between 2 points, and that movement, however slow, continue in some direction across enough generations. In a Pangaean or near Pangaean world, the largest obstacles would be deserts, mountain chains, ice, or extreme heat and cold. But even these tend to be porous. They filter movement, not forbid it. Take deserts. They are often imagined as vast, empty, uniform wastelands. In reality, deserts have margins, corridors, oases, and seasonal variations. People learn them. They study which stars to follow at night, how to recognize certain rock formations that hint at underground water, how to move at night and rest by day. They time their crossings to cooler seasons or after rare rains. They learn from animals that survive there. Deserts slow expansion, but they don't erase it. Mountains operate similarly. They channel movement into passes, ridges, and valleys. They raise the effort cost, but they also offer shelter from wind, sources of fresh water, and vantage points. Humans have repeatedly crossed high terrain with surprisingly minimal equipment, using nothing but knowledge, grit, social support, and simple tools. Cold regions are their own trial, demanding clothes, shelter, and coordination to make it through long, dark winters. Yet we know that even very early humans adapted to icy environments, developing layered clothing, windbreaks, and strategies for sharing food and warmth. On a supercontinent, cold zones stretch across long belts. Moving into them would be gradual. Each generation would live slightly farther into the cold than the last, enough for bodies and knowledge systems to adjust. That gradualness is essential. Rapid, shocking transitions are dangerous. Slow transitions can be understood. A family might only move a few kilometers beyond where their parents settled, but over many cycles, that pattern can span thousands of kilometers without anyone ever feeling like they have uprooted their life in a single leap. To support this, humans rely on mental maps, not gridded like modern charts, but relational. Instead of coordinates, think in chains. Beyond the big bend in the river, after the wide, dry place where the wind never stops, 2 days' walk from the stone that looks like an animal's head. These maps live in narrative and song, in repeated instructions, in landmarks that are both physical and symbolic. Stories here are not entertainment first. They are storage. They hold information about paths, hazards, and opportunities. When land is continuous, those stories can travel with people. A tale told about a dangerous crossing might be repeated and adapted many times as it moves farther from its origin, but the warning function remains. In this way, knowledge can leap ahead of direct experience. Walking also shapes perception because it forces travel to happen at human speed. You feel every slope, every step of altitude gain, every shift in the grain of the soil. You learn how a plant community changes as you climb or descend. You notice how the behavior of animals shifts as you move closer to or farther from water. That constant feedback loop between body and landscape builds a kind of familiarity that is not easily erased. When you arrive in a new place, it is never entirely unfamiliar. It's some combination of patterns you've seen before. This valley's wind reminds you of that other place. This soil cracks like the ground where your grandparents lived. This bird call signals water nearby, just as it did back there. That recognition allows you to apply strategies rather than freeze. We also have to factor time correctly. When we ask whether early humans could have walked from one end of the world to the other, we sometimes imagine a single continuous expedition. But real human movement is more like a tide than a sprint. Groups flow forward, then settle. Some lineages continue moving. Others double back. Branches die off. New branches form. Over 100 or 1,000 generations, this messy pattern can still fill the map. And it doesn't only flow outward. People return. They retrace routes to visit seasonal meeting sites, to reconnect with distant relatives, to access resources that renew at specific intervals. News and techniques travel back as well as forward. A tool type invented far along one branch of movement might find its way backward through marriage, trade, or shared rituals at regular gathering sites. This two-way motion maintains continuity. It slows the rate at which distant groups become incomprehensible to each other. It keeps a loose net of cultural and genetic connections stretched across large areas. That net is harder to maintain once oceans intrude. Water creates sharp breaks. Crossing it requires tools and knowledge that not everyone will develop or adopt. On a single landmass, walking remains the primary and sufficient technology to keep humans connected. The motivation to keep walking is simple. Many problems are easier to solve by leaving. If a local ecosystem is overused, you move. If conflict with neighbors becomes tense, you move. If climate shifts make your region less forgiving, you explore farther. Settlement becomes appealing only when the benefits of staying in one place outweigh the flexibility of movement. Intensive agriculture, permanent villages, and sharply defined territories often arise under constraints. Limited fertile land, reliable but localized water, or environmental barriers that pen people in. On a full supercontinent, with immense interiors and broad gradients, mobility stays useful longer. This doesn't prevent settlement. It just keeps it from becoming the only successful strategy too early. In that setting, social structures might lean less toward rigid hierarchy and more toward situational leadership. A person's status might come from knowing certain routes, recognizing cloud patterns, predicting animal movements, or mediating disputes, rather than controlling land. Authority would be embedded in memory and skill, rather than property titles. This kind of world leaves very little for archaeologists to find. A people who move often, build lightly, and use mostly perishable materials can occupy a landscape deeply without stacking up stone, metal, and brick. Their traces are small: hearths, occasional buried tools, disturbed soil, patterns in charcoal layers. The spaces between those traces are likely full of movement rather than emptiness. We tend to interpret scattered early sites as islands of human presence surrounded by nothing. But in a continuous, walkable world, those dots might be more like snapshots along a trail. Camps that were used repeatedly but not permanently. Meeting points within a much larger living network. Boundaries, in such a context, are less about political jurisdiction and more about ecological zones. They shift as climate shifts, they have fuzzy edges, they signal changes in lifestyle more than declarations of ownership. Crossing them means adapting, different food, different shelter, different timing, not getting a stamp in a passport. As Pangaea and its successor configurations eventually tore apart and oceans widened, these fluid boundaries hardened. What used to be gradients became edges. Movement stopped being the first answer to stress. It started to become one option among many, sometimes blocked, sometimes dangerous. But before that, walking remained a remarkably effective, low-tech method of exploring and inhabiting a single, enormous surface. So when we ask whether early humans could have walked the world end to end, we might reframe it, not as a question about a single heroic act, but about whether the world was structured to allow that kind of reach. On a unified landmass, with enough time, enough patience, and enough overlapping generations, the answer leans strongly toward yes. Not all at once, not as a recorded feat, but as an ordinary byproduct of ordinary decisions stretched across deep time. The world, in that sense, was not raced across. It was worn in, softened by footfalls, mapped in story, learned slowly. And as the land later pulled away from itself, creating seas in the gaps, humanity carried from that previous arrangement a deep, quiet memory of a time when the horizon meant challenge, not impossibility. A time when the idea of an end of the world had not yet hardened into the line where land meets open ocean. Life on a supercontinent is ruled less by comfort and more by pattern. Climate, seasons, and survival blur into a single, ongoing negotiation. On Pangaea, the environment wasn't a passive background. It was an instructor. Every turn in the wind, every shift in temperature, every delay in the usual rains offered information. To live there, especially as an early human or human ancestor, was to learn that language or pay the cost. The first thing to notice about climate on a supercontinent is scale. When land stretches almost unbroken for thousands of kilometers, familiar climate behaviors amplify. Oceans act as giant thermal buffers. They soak up heat, release it slowly, and wash coastlines with more moderate air. Interior land, without that buffer, swings harder between extremes. Pangaea contains some of the largest such interiors Earth has ever seen. Many of those interior regions were dominated by aridity. Their position, far from moisture sources and often downwind of mountain ranges that stripped passing air of water, left them dry for long periods. But dry did not mean identical from place to place. Some areas held scrublands with seasonal greening. Others were dune fields. Others, rocky deserts with sparse, tough vegetation clinging to fractures and low spots. Rainfall in such places could be a rare, transformative event. Months or years of dryness might be broken by short, powerful storms. Dry riverbeds would come alive, turning into rushing streams or temporary torrents. Low-lying basins would fill, becoming shallow lakes that might last for days, weeks, or longer. Plants and animals tuned to these cycles would take advantage immediately. In climates like that, survival hinges less on total rainfall and more on timing. A few intense storms at the wrong moment might be almost useless. A slightly longer or earlier wet phase could mean a full season of growth instead of a brief flash. For humans, that makes seasonal awareness not just helpful, but critical. Missing a timing window by a few weeks could be the difference between following an animal migration and arriving behind it, between reaching a water source at its peak or as it dries to mud. Seasonality on Pangaea was also sharpened in many latitudes. Without nearby water to moderate spring and autumn, transitions could be abrupt. The world could move quickly from tolerable to dangerous. Surviving such shifts encourages planning. You don't just react to the weather, you anticipate it, based on patterns remembered across years and generations. For early humans, mobility would be the main tool for dealing with these swings. On a supercontinent, climate doesn't only change over time, it changes over space. Move far enough in one direction, and you may find cooler air, more frequent rain, different plants and animals. If a particular region consistently became too harsh during part of the year, groups could build that fact into their annual cycle, leaving, then returning when conditions improved. Animals did the same. Large herbivores followed vegetation waves, moving from one feeding ground to another as plants sprouted, matured, and dried. Predators followed the herbivores. Humans, hunting or scavenging or foraging alongside these dynamics, learned to read them. If a herd arrived thinner than expected, if a bird species left earlier, if a flowering plant failed to bloom, those signs might hint at deeper change in rainfall or temperature. Plant life, in turn, offered a calendar. Certain species only produced seeds or fruit under specific conditions. Others sprouted reliably after flooding. Learning these relationships took time, observation, and shared teaching. But once learned, they became part of the group's inherited climate sense. Temperature extremes layered more difficulty on top. In Pangaea's interiors, daytime heat could push bodies to their limits, while clear, dry nights could cool the world quickly. These swings demanded behavioral adjustment: travel at dawn and dusk, rest in shade or dugout shelters. Use clothing not just for warmth, but for sun defense. Fire for more than comfort fire as a way to manage both cold and psychological safety in a vast, quiet dark. Where winters were strong, humans needed additional tools: insulated shelters, layered garments, shared sleeping spaces, stockpiled food, or knowledge of winter-available resources. These needs pushed social cooperation. It's hard to endure long, harsh seasons alone. Groups that coordinated, shared, and planned had better odds. In that sense, climate selected for collaboration. Winds across a supercontinent also matter. With so much land, air masses can heat, cool, and dry out over huge tracts before they release their moisture. Seasonal contrast between heated interiors and cooler coasts can drive monsoon-like systems, wet summers, dry winters, or other rhythmic patterns. Once these patterns settle in, they become as much a part of life as sunrise. Again, predictability is key. A harsh but regular monsoon cycle can support elaborate survival strategies. Completely erratic weather is harder to live with. On Pangaea, many regions likely developed rough but dependable seasonal signals: wind directions that always shift in a particular month, cloud towers that always appear at a certain time, stars that rise just before the first serious rains. Water, above all, organizes everything. In a supercontinental world, big river systems may run long distances between interior highs and coastal lows. Smaller streams may flicker on and off with storms, lakes may fill and empty, springs may appear where deep fractures bring groundwater to the surface. Human groups track these liquid threads with intense care. A forgotten spring, a misremembered turn in a river, can be fatal. That knowledge is often distributed within the group. Some individuals specialize in reading subtle ground signs for subterranean moisture. Others watch animal behavior. Others memorize the overarching rhythm of wet and dry years. Combined, these skills form a climate sense that far exceeds any one person's ability. Culture, in this context, is shared perception. Scarcity, repeated enough times, shapes values. In a world where good years alternate with lean ones, hoarding may seem smart in the moment but dangerous in the long run if it undermines group cohesion. Sharing, restraint, and careful use of abundance become long-tested survival strategies. They are not moral codes in the abstract. They are responses to repeated environmental lessons. Diets under such pressures lean toward diversity. Relying on one crop or one animal is too risky. Instead, people learn wide repertoires: nuts, roots, tubers, opportunistic hunting, insects, fish where available, scavenging when possible. The more options you know, the more flexible you are when the climate's script changes slightly. Length of stay in each place is dictated by resources and predictability. In regions where climate is too variable, long-term settlement is a gamble. If a key water source fails, leaving becomes urgent. Seasonal round circuits that bring groups back to the same places at roughly the same times each year offer a compromise between familiarity and mobility. Land is known, but not clung to. Attachment is practical, not absolute. Over very long periods, stability in the overall climate pattern of Pangaea, even if locally harsh, allowed strategies to accumulate. Because the supercontinent configuration persisted for tens of millions of years, once certain patterns set in, they stuck around long enough for life to adapt in depth. This meant that for any hypothetical human or hominin groups, learned responses would remain valid for many generations. Refinement could dominate over constant reinvention. As the plates slowly began to pull apart and new ocean basins opened, those climate patterns shifted. Fresh coastlines invited moisture deeper inland. Ocean currents reorganized. Areas that had been marginal could become more hospitable. Others went the opposite way, drying further or cooling beyond previous limits. Populations living in the middle of these shifts would have to adjust on the fly. They would do so with the same tools: observation, collaboration, story, movement. But because the changes would sometimes unsettle long-held expectations, risk would rise. People might stick to old timings that no longer matched new weather. Old paths might lead into regions that had lost their reliability. Hard-learned wisdom would need to be re-edited. In that sense, climate on a supercontinent doesn't simply test survival. It helps select for the qualities that later define our species: flexibility, cooperative planning, long-term memory, and the ability to reframe behavior in response to subtle environmental cues. Surviving Pangaea's moods would not be about conquering nature. It would be about listening closely, adjusting frequently, and teaching what you learned fast enough that it mattered. Time, under such a regime, is understood less as a straight line and more as a series of loops and waves. The return of rains, the angle of the sun, the calls of certain creatures, the length of shadows. These repeating markers anchor human experience more deeply than any numbered calendar. They encourage patience. You cannot force a season, you can only prepare for it and meet it as it arrives. As continents later slid apart and climates reconfigured once more, those habits of attention and adaptation did not vanish. They persisted in new forms, in farmers tracking subtle shifts in planting seasons, in sailors reading wind and wave, in city dwellers noticing when the air behaves strangely. The patterns learned on a joined world continued to guide life on a divided one, even as the background conditions changed again. In that way, the climate of Pangaea lives on not just in rocks and fossils, but in the deep structure of how humans think about weather, time, and change, as something to be watched, interpreted, and lived with, rather than something that ever truly stands still. When we turn our attention to the animals, plants, and neighbors of that lost age, it helps to pause on the word neighbor itself. Not in the modern sense of adjacent property or shared walls, but in the older sense of anything that shares your space, your seasons, your water, your risks. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, life did not cluster in tiny cut-off patches the way it can on islands. It spread across a joined surface where plant, animal, and human lives overlapped through sheer proximity. To survive, there was to be woven into a living network far larger than any one group. Plant life built the base of that network. Long before mammals or any hypothetical humans mattered, plants had already mastered many of Pangaea's extremes. In the dry, interior belts, vegetation leaned toward endurance over profusion. Deep-rooted shrubs, waxy-leaved species, and low, tough growths that could shrug off long droughts took hold. They grew slowly, conserved water, and responded quickly to rare rain. Along rivers, lakes, and former floodplains, the picture changed. There, moisture and nutrient-rich sediments allowed grasses, herbs, and fast-growing weeds to burst into brief abundance after floods. Seasonal greenery flared then faded. Farther toward coasts and wetter regions, forests rose, coniferous stands, seed ferns, early broadleaf analogs depending on the era. Canopies formed layers of light and shadow, and understories developed their own logic. These plants were not static scenery. They directed animal movement. Grazers ranged across plains following the timing of new shoots and seed heads. Browsers moved through shrubs and forest edges. Seed dispersal by wind, water, and especially by animals. Let plant lineages reach far beyond their point of origin. On an unbroken land, that reach could span half a world. For human or hominin groups, plants were intimate neighbors. Food, medicine, tools, fuel, shelter, and signals all came from them. Knowing plants was as essential as knowing the sky. Which roots were safe, which leaves healed or harmed, which barks burned hot and long, which smokes repelled biting insects. These distinctions weren't nice-to-have trivia. They were core survival knowledge. Because Pangaea's land was continuous, similar plant communities might appear across widely separated regions with gradual shifts rather than abrupt replacements. A group moving into a new area might find close relatives of plants they already knew, behaving similarly enough to be useful. That continuity meant that plant lore could travel. You might still need caution and experiment, but you wouldn't be starting blind at every step. Animal life, layered over this vegetative mosaic, was also shaped by the scale of land. Large herbivores, depending on the period, including creatures very unlike anything alive, now roamed vast territories in search of pasture and water. Carnivores tracked them. Smaller animals and omnivores filled niches defined by these broader movements, scavenging kills, feeding on seeds and insects, burrowing, climbing, adapting. On an unbroken continent, many species ranges were enormous. Populations could shift their centers of activity over long distances as climate zones moved or local conditions changed. Extinction still happened, but so did resilience through dispersal. For any intelligent two-legged neighbor, animals were at once resource, teacher, competitor, and threat. Large herbivores offered meat, hides, bones, tendons, high-value packages that could sustain groups but demanded serious risk and effort to obtain. Smaller animals, birds, reptiles, and fish offered more frequent but smaller returns. Insects, larvae, and other tiny life forms provided critical protein and fat when bigger game was scarce. Hunting strategies had to match animal behavior, and on a supercontinent, that behavior was shaped by wide, open routes. Persistence hunting, ambush along game trails, group drives toward natural traps, or stealth at waterholes would evolve in response to how herds and predators moved through particular landscapes. Success at this scale depended on close observation, tracking subtle signs, reading droppings and footprints, listening for distant hoofbeats or wing beats. Humans did not dominate this animal world outright. They negotiated with it, sometimes literally, sometimes through persistent trial and error. They learned where not to walk during certain hours when predators were active. They learned what kinds of fire scared which animals, where dens and nests tended to be, how to avoid corridors heavily used by dangerous competitors. Fire, once it entered the relationship, became a powerful tool for rebalancing roles, clearing undergrowth, luring grazers with fresh regrowth, keeping predators at bay. Animals themselves were far from constant. Species ranges shifted. Some lineages diversified, others collapsed. Climatic pulses, volcanic events, and slow ecological cascades could change which animals appeared where over spans of many generations. Humans lived inside that churn, adjusting as neighbors changed. Then, there were the human neighbors. On a supercontinent, encounters between different human or hominin groups were inevitable. Distances were large, but nothing like the yawning discontinuity of an open ocean. Over time, groups moving along different paths or timing their migrations differently would intersect. Sometimes that meant friendly exchange, sometimes wary standoff, sometimes conflict. But it almost never meant absolute and permanent separation. Some groups would share close ancestry and language patterns. Others would be more distantly related, with distinct habits and appearances. But through long networks of contact, few would be completely foreign in the way we might think of people on an entirely different continent today. In such a context, relationships between groups could take many forms: trading of materials found only in one region, sharing of specialized hunting or plant knowledge, mutual defense against dangerous predators, arranged partnerships and marriages to strengthen ties, or temporary cohabitation of rich seasonal grounds. Conflicts too would arise over access to water, game, or particular sacred or strategic places. But because movement remained possible, conflict did not always have to end in domination or annihilation. It could also end in divergence, one group going another way. Culture in such a web isn't made of isolated traditions growing in sealed containers. It behaves more like a gradient. Practices blend where contact is frequent, differentiate where it is rare. Stories, symbols, tool styles, and rituals can spread slowly across surprisingly large distances, changing flavor but retaining recognizable scaffolding. Plants and animals join that cultural exchange. A group famous for knowing a particular medicinal plant might share or demonstrate that knowledge. Another known for crafting specific traps or using certain animal parts in distinctive ways could contribute a technology that others adapt. In turn, those others might carry that plant or practice farther along their own paths. Over long stretches of time, these shared experiments could produce proto-domestication. Certain animals, perhaps those that tolerated human presence, scavenged near camps, or were less fearful when young might form looser, then tighter bonds with people. Some plants might flourish in the disturbed soils around habitations and fire-cleared areas. Humans would notice which ones liked their presence and start favoring them, even if they never consciously thought of themselves as managing them. Domestication, in this sense, doesn't start as a sudden, one-time invention. It grows out of repeated, reciprocal relationships between humans and other species. On a unified landmass, such relationships could be tested and shared across wide areas, refined repeatedly, and reinvented in more than one place with similar outcomes. Invisible neighbors shaped life too. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, and symbiotic microbes all moved through this joined world. In a connected landmass, diseases could spread more easily at first, but also more gradually. Populations might face waves of sickness that rolled through, leaving survivors with immunity that then diffused outward. Over time, this gradual exposure could build broad resilience that is harder to achieve in tiny, isolated pockets, suddenly exposed to entirely new pathogens. Controlled fire altered disease dynamics as well. Regular burning changed insect populations, reduced parasite loads in some contexts, and created mosaics of habitats with different risk profiles. On Pangaea, if fire practices spread widely, they could shape entire ecosystems, creating patterns of plant and animal presence that carried a human signature. These human influences did not yet dominate the planet the way they do now, but they were real. Fires, hunting pressures, preferred camp locations, and repeated path use all left marks. From a deep-time vantage, these marks are subtle. Charcoal layers and sediments, shifts in the age structure of certain animal populations, changes in plant community composition near frequent camps. The land registered the presence of its human neighbors, even when those humans did not build stone monuments. As the supercontinent fragmented, this tight weave of relationships began to fray. Plant species that once spread across continuous habitat found new barriers. Animal migrations were cut by bays, gulfs, and newly formed seas. Human groups that had once met seasonally found their paths flooded or lengthened beyond practicality. Elders remembered other peoples and species that younger generations never saw. Life on Pangaea can be understood then as an ongoing negotiation among plants, animals, humans, and microbes, playing out on a land that invited connection. Survival depended not on mastering a static environment, but on staying in tune with a living, shifting community. Plants told you where water lingered, animals told you how the climate was changing, other humans told you new ways of adjusting. All were neighbors in the deepest sense, not always friendly, not always safe, but interdependent. Imagining that time clearly means resisting two easy errors. One is romanticizing it as a golden harmony without struggle. The other is flattening it into nothing but brutality. Reality lay between harsh lessons, high mortality, constant work, but also pattern, learning, and balance, refined over long periods. As Earth's crust kept moving and continents slid toward the arrangement we now know, those relationships reorganized. New neighbors arrived, old neighbors disappeared, and the conditions that had allowed knowledge to flow so widely began to vanish. Yet echoes of that earlier interconnected life remain still in plant families that appear on opposite sides of oceans, in similar animal niches filled by related species on different continents, and in human stories and practices that seem to rhyme across seas. The animals, plants, and neighbors of that lost age were never just background to an emerging humanity. They were co-authors, shaping what was possible, what was learned, and what was remembered across a world that had not yet chosen to break itself into separate pieces. Fire, tools, and the first shared knowledge did not step onto that stage as neat milestones. They oozed into existence gradually, smoothed and sharpened by need. On a supercontinent where paths remained open and meetings between groups were part of the landscape's logic, these things were not the property of one people or place. They were shared outcomes of trial, error, and observation, moving along with the feet that carried them. Fire, to begin with, is less a thing than a relationship. Long before anyone knew how to coax sparks from stone or friction from wood, there was lightning. In Pangaea's dry interiors and storm-prone zones, lightning could frequently strike parched vegetation, igniting wildfires that galloped across the land. Those burns cleared old plant matter, exposed fresh soil, triggered the germination of certain seeds, and changed how animals moved. Early humans or their ancestors would have watched these events with fear and fascination. They would have seen animals fleeing, then returning to feed on new growth in burned areas. They might have discovered by accident that some foods tasted different or easier to digest after being exposed to residual heat. They would have noticed that predators kept their distance from active flames. At first, fire was something you encountered, not controlled. A charred branch might still hold a living coal. A lightning-struck tree might smolder for days. The first human relationship with fire may have been like the relationship with a dangerous but useful wild animal. Keep your distance, benefit when you can, flee when it surges. The next step was not invention, but stewardship. Instead of creating fire from nothing, people learned to keep it. Carrying embers between camps, feeding small hearths, shielding flames from wind and rain, and reviving coals from ash required skill and attention. In this period, fire was a fragile blessing. Lose it, and you might spend a long time without it. Once fire could be maintained reliably, it reorganized human life. It extended the day into the night. It offered warmth in cold places and seasons. It made tough foods softer and safer. It could be used to harden wooden points, to clear patches of land, to keep biting insects away, and to signal others. Beneath the Pangaean sky, fire widened the range of habitats humans could use and altered their daily rhythms. Because land was connected, fire knowledge could spread as people met. Groups without fire might see it in the distance, approach cautiously, and learn. Techniques for carrying embers, building hearths, and selecting fuel could diffuse gradually. Firekeeping would become a respected competence. Individuals particularly skilled at reading and managing flame might gain quiet influence, not as rulers, but as vital contributors. Tools followed a parallel path. The earliest stone tools were likely simple flakes and cores, struck to create a sharp edge. Selecting which stones to hit, where to strike, and how to hold them represented a cognitive leap. Seeing potential in raw material, planning a sequence of actions, and anticipating a result that did not yet exist. On Pangaea, suitable rocks like flint, chert, obsidian, or other nappable stones might appear in concentrated deposits separated by long distances. Groups living near these sources would have an advantage in tool production. But as people moved and met, stone and knowledge both traveled. A finished blade might journey far from the quarry where its raw material began, swapped, gifted, or carried as part of a migration. Crucially, the idea of a shaped edge could survive even when the exact stone did not. People in a different region, working with less ideal materials, might still copy the general form. Over time, this could produce functionally similar tools made from different local resources. The spread of technique was more important than the spread of stone. Fire and tools combined multiplied possibilities. Heat could make some stones easier to flake. It could be used to produce glues and resins for hafting spear points or knife blades onto handles. Fire-hardened woods made for more durable digging sticks, spears, and supports. Together, flame and steel-like edges expanded what humans could cut, process, dig, and build. Shared knowledge emerged in the spaces between these practical acts. Knowing that a particular type of stone makes better blades, that certain woods burn cleaner, that some plants produce strong fibers or sticky resins, all of these things live first in hands and habits. They are encoded in how tasks are done, not in written instructions. To transmit such knowledge, early people would have relied on a rich mix of demonstration, imitation, and rudimentary language. A child watching an elder knap stone or tend fire learns by seeing, then trying, then receiving correction. Over time, specific gestures, sounds, and later words would be associated with these processes, making teaching more efficient. In a connected world, these teaching moments did not stay trapped inside single bands. Visits between groups, shared campsites during migrations, and intermarriage all created opportunities for cross-pollination. One group might show another a better way to grind a certain seed, another might offer a superior binding technique for spearheads. No one needed to conceive of this as technology transfer. It was simply part of living together on the same broad land. Fire also compelled social structure. A communal flame became a focus that drew people close at night. Stories, songs, tool repair, and quiet conversation all gathered around its light. This created a natural time and place for sharing information about where animals were, where water had been found, which neighboring groups had been encountered, what the sky had done recently. Around fires, the first extended reflective conversations likely happened, not just about immediate danger or need, but about patterns, memories, and possibilities. In that sense, fire-lit circles were proto-classrooms, proto-councils, proto-theaters. They supported the growth of narrative and abstract thought. Tool-making, too, fostered roles. Not everyone would be equally skilled at shaping stone or bone or wood. Specialists could emerge organically, recognized not by rank but by competence. Their work would be valued. They would teach others, and their preferences could influence the evolution of local tool traditions. As both fire and tools matured, humans began to leave a larger imprint on their environment. Controlled burns changed plant communities. Concentrated hunting pressure altered animal behavior and distributions. Paths worn by frequent travel subtly reshaped soils and vegetation. It was not yet the total transformation we see in later farming or industrial societies, but it was the start of a feedback loop. Humans changing the land changing humans. Shared knowledge did not advance in a straight line. Some techniques were lost when groups died out or moved away from key resources. Fires went out, quarries were abandoned. But in a still connected land, loss was less likely to be permanent. Other groups could reintroduce knowledge. Encounters could restart learning chains that had broken. Over great distances and long years, fire use became nearly universal among human groups. Basic stone tools stabilized into familiar families of forms. Skills that had once been rare innovations became background expectations. People everywhere on the supercontinent would recognize, at a glance, another group's relationship with fire and stone, how they struck sparks, how they knapped, how they built hearths, even if the details differed. None of this required writing, monuments, or cities. It required only repetition, openness, and patient attention to cause and effect. Fire taught that intensity must be managed. Too much, and it destroys. Too little, and it dies. Tools taught that precision and angle matter. A flake struck carelessly wastes stone. A cut made clumsily harms more than it helps. These lessons, ingrained early and widespread, did more than build technology. They trained thinking. They encouraged planning ahead, evaluating outcomes, and learning from failure rather than repeating it blindly. On a world where continents were joined, these thinking habits had room to spread with every step people took. As Earth later pulled Pangaea apart, those wide networks of shared learning began to fragment. Fire and tools did not vanish, but their development paths diverged region by region. New pressures, new materials, and new constraints drove innovation along separate tracks. Written language, storage technologies, and formal education systems emerged as ways to preserve and coordinate knowledge within increasingly bounded spaces. Yet underneath those later achievements lies the quieter foundation built earlier, a long period when the land itself favored sharing over separation, when survival depended on showing others how as much as telling them what, when the most important libraries were living minds and the earliest laboratories were campfires glowing under a single continuous sky. When a single land stretches on without hard breaks, language and culture grow like living gradients rather than sealed containers. They are not invented once and then frozen. They unfold, bend, and blend, shaped by walking, meeting, and the slow drift of habits across space. On a supercontinent like Pangaea, where Earth joins more than it divides, communication is not boxed into isolated corners. It flows. In the earliest phases, language is inseparable from action. It rises out of shared tasks and shared dangers. Before it names abstract ideas, it names what must be coordinated. Calls that warn, sounds that summon, signals that mean now, here, stop, follow. Gestures, postures, and facial expressions accompany these sounds, reinforcing or substituting for spoken patterns. On a continuous landmass, early vocal systems are exposed to variation in a gentle way. A particular sound used to signal food, danger, or direction might shift in tone, rhythm, or accent as it moves along a route. But because groups continue to meet, those shifts tend not to break understanding completely. A traveler might reach a new region and notice that words feel different in the mouth and on the ear, but still grasp meaning with the help of context and motion. This is one of the quiet consequences of a single, joined land. Languages don't shatter into mutually incomprehensible pieces as quickly. Instead, they stretch. Differences accumulate slowly along distance, as if each camp along a long road adds a slight twist to an ongoing melody. The result is fewer deep splits early on, and more broad families of speech that remain intelligible over long distances, especially with patience. Regional vocabularies may develop for particular plants, animals, or landscape features. Grammar might bend toward local preferences, but shared roots and structures linger. Culture rides along with this continuity. Stories, rituals, and symbolic practices spread because people do. When groups meet regularly, seasonally, cyclically, or by chance, they bring not just tools and goods, but ways of telling and doing. A myth born in one river valley might appear centuries later in a distant plateau, changed in detail, but recognizable in shape. The heroes have different names, the mountains wear different outlines, the animals reflect local species, but the underlying pattern, a journey, a test, a sacrifice, a transformation, remains. These traveling stories are more than entertainment. They carry information coded into narrative about where to find water, how to behave in storms, what happens if certain taboos are broken, which animals should not be hunted at certain times. On a supercontinent, such stories can drift astonishingly far, anchoring shared expectations across lands that will one day be separate continents. Rituals, too, evolve under these conditions. At their simplest, rituals are predictable sequences of behavior that reduce uncertainty. Greetings, partings, exchanges, reconciliations. When groups see each other often enough, effective rituals spread. A particular gesture to show peaceful intent, a specific way of offering food, a shared dance step that signals willingness to cooperate. In a fragmented world, ritual often hardens into a boundary marker, a way to distinguish us from them. In a connected world, ritual begins more often as a bridge. It lowers risk when approaching strangers. It builds trust quickly. It helps both sides predict what the other will do. The more often strangers are encountered, the more valuable these shared patterns become. Art forms early in this story are likely simple by our standards but powerful in effect. Body paint, scarification, jewelry from bone, shell, or stone, rhythmic movement, handprints, carved lines, these express identity, memory, and belonging. On Pangaea, motifs might echo faintly across huge areas because they move with people. A spiral here, a zigzag there, a particular way of pairing colors, somewhere else. All variations of themes carried along migration routes. Music and rhythm may travel even more easily. Human bodies share a common tempo. Heartbeat, breath, footfall. Work and movement produce repeating sounds which become patterns, which become songs. On a single land, work songs for hauling, grinding, paddling inland waters, or walking long distances could show similarities across regions without anyone ever planning it. The beat that keeps feet in sync feels natural everywhere. Dance and bodily movement also communicate. How people stand, sit, greet, and mourn carries cultural weight. These physical languages are slower to fragment when people keep meeting and learning from one another. Small differences mark local flavor, but the basic grammar of gesture remains readable. In such a world, identity forms less along rigid territorial lines and more around lineage, practice, and shared stories. You might say, we are the people who move with these herds, or we are the ones who know these plants, more readily than we are from this exact, bounded plot of land. Belonging is portable. It moves with you, carried in memory and in the relationships you maintain. Hospitality, in this setting, evolves from necessity. Strangers are not a rare, alarming anomaly. They are a regular feature of life. Some carry news. Some bring tools or materials from far away. Some bring new marriages, alliances, or warnings. Turning everyone away is dangerous. Accepting everyone without caution is also dangerous. So cultures learn a middle path. Codes of welcome and testing. Guests are offered food, fire, or shelter under certain conditions, and in return, follow certain rules. Language adapts to this pattern of life. Words for directions, distances, and environmental conditions proliferate. While modern languages might say north or south, earlier languages may have relied more heavily on relational phrases. Toward the setting sun in the cold season, beyond the hills where the river narrows, against the wind that comes before the big rains. Time, likewise, is described through cycles. After the first frosts, before the longest day, when the birds with red wings return. Grammar becomes a tool for clarity. Who did what, when, to whom, and under what conditions. The more people move and coordinate, the more useful such clarity becomes. Over generations, syntax and structure become robust through trial. Confusing phrasing gets corrected. Efficient phrasing spreads. Culture in this context is not static tradition. It is dynamic practice, maintained through contact. If contact decreases, culture solidifies. If contact is steady, culture flexes. On a supercontinent that remains relatively open for long periods, flexing dominates. Local differences grow, but underlying logic stays broadly shared. Even spiritual ideas are shaped by this geography. When land is continuous, origin stories are less likely to foreground a single unreachable homeland. Instead, they might speak of emergence across the land, of ancestors who walked great circuits, of spirits associated with journeys, crossroads, rivers, and winds. A traveling people will imagine traveling gods and traveling souls. Still, local environments matter. A group that lives mostly in forest will imagine the unseen in terms of concealment, shadows, and sudden appearances. A group on open steppe might imagine the unseen more in terms of distance, storms, or horizons. But because the same sky arches over both, a shared layer of cosmology persists. Constellations, sun paths, phases of the moon. These provide a common ceiling under which different but resonant stories arise. When groups meet, these worldviews are compared in conversation and ceremony. People may adopt certain elements from others that make sense to them, such as a particularly powerful symbol, a story that clarifies something they had felt but never named, or a ritual that seems effective in coping with fear or loss. Cultural borrowing becomes as normal as genetic exchange. As the supercontinent slowly begins to fracture, these processes start to change. Less frequent contact means fewer opportunities to compare, borrow, and adapt. Languages diverge faster. Myths localize. Practices that were once shared drift apart. Boundaries, which were once mostly ecological and flexible, begin to take on more social and symbolic weight. But before that fragmentation is complete, language and culture on a single land experience a long age of continuity, one in which diversity grows outward from a shared base rather than bursting into isolated branches overnight. That long age may explain why, today, myths from far-flung cultures often feel strangely familiar. The common structures they share, journeys, tricksters, floods, sky beings, cycles of death and rebirth, are not proof of direct contact between every people. They are evidence of deep, shared patterns of human thought formed under conditions that once made connection easier than separation. Even now, when we learn a language far from our own, we often find points of resonance, similar metaphors, parallel proverbs, recognizable story arcs. That resonance reflects an inheritance older than any one civilization, a memory of when language and culture stretched across a single continuous earth rather than having to leap across oceans. Trade without oceans and journeys without borders on such a world would hardly resemble our modern image of bustling seaports or caravans marked out on maps with dotted lines. Instead, exchange would be braided through everyday movement. There would be no separate profession called trader at first. There would just be people going where they needed to go, bringing what they had, noticing what others carried. In a world where land does not abruptly end in deep water, borders are felt more as changes than as lines. The shift from one region to another happens in the thickness of the air, in the color of soil, in the composition of plants, in the way people speak and dress, not at a line on the ground. You know you have moved, but you can't point to a single point where everything suddenly switched. Trade at its core is about mismatch. You have what I lack, I have what you lack. In a unified landmass, that mismatch arises naturally as geology, climate, and biology vary over distance. One region might hold a rare stone perfect for tools. Another might host plants with strong fibers. Another might enjoy consistent access to a certain kind of game, pigment, or shell from an inland sea. As people move along their seasonal or exploratory paths, they encounter these differences. A group arriving in a new area might notice beautifully sharp tools made from an unfamiliar rock, or ornaments shaped from a material not found near their home. Curiosity sparks conversation, gesture, imitation. Sometimes things are traded deliberately. A piece of stone for a hide, a tool for food, a crafted item for a promise of future help. Other times, the real trade is knowledge. How to shape, where to find, when to harvest. On Pangaea, trade would be slow but deep. A chunk of obsidian might begin its journey near a volcanic source. It passes from one group to another, perhaps swapped for meat, or gifted as part of a marriage alliance. Each time it moves a little farther, acquiring new stories with each transfer. By the time someone hundreds of kilometers away holds it, the stone has become more than a tool. It has become a piece of a narrative. This came from the land of fire, beyond 3 mountain chains and a river that turns red in spring. Similarly, shells from an inland sea might find their way to forests, deserts, or uplands. Pigments unique to certain rocks might color bodies and objects far from their geological birthplaces. None of this requires deliberate long-distance expeditions. It only requires that every movement carries along a few meaningful things, and that each meeting between groups creates an opportunity for exchange. Because paths are flexible and not channeled into narrow corridors, no single group or region can easily monopolize a resource. If one route becomes too dangerous or demanding, another route can be found. Power based solely on controlling a particular choke point is less stable in a landscape where choke points are rare. Travelers in this world would be storytellers as much as carriers of goods. When they arrive somewhere, they bring accounts of what the weather has done in distant places, of where game has moved, of other groups they've met, of plants and animals newly observed. Information spreads in this way faster than objects can. A story can leap ahead of a material, preparing people to value it or fear it before it ever arrives. Journeys without borders also mean that few trips are one way. People return, sometimes by the same path, sometimes by a loop. As they do, they weave information back into their home regions. They might introduce a new technique learned from another group, or a new understanding of a hazard. Their children may grow up with stories of places they never visit but still know in abstract. As Pangaea continues to shift and the first large seas cut into its body, these land-based networks begin to feel pressure. Paths that once crossed shallow basins start encountering deeper water. Detours grow longer. Certain hubs of exchange lose their centrality, while new coastal or riverine hubs form. Experimentation with rafts or simple boats may begin in areas where water crossings are short and tempting. But before water demands that leap, trade remains mainly a matter of persistence and routes. Goods don't rush from one edge of the world to the other. They meander. They stay embedded in the relationships that move them. There are no anonymous shipments, no silent crates. Every moved object passes hand to hand with some context attached. Who carried it? Where they got it? What they were willing to give for it? This slower, more personal exchange shapes how value is understood. Rareness is not only a function of supply and demand, it is also a function of story. An object from far away is precious, not just because it's hard to obtain, but because it carries with it the weight of distance and the memories of everyone who handled it. Even when fragmentation arrives and oceans grow wide, these early habits of exchange leave a mark. Human beings continue to treat some goods as meaningful beyond their practical use, as symbols of connection, as proxies for journeys, as reminders that somewhere else exists and can, sometimes, be reached. In that sense, early trade on a joined world does more than move things around. It rehearses the idea that humans, spread across large spaces, are nonetheless part of overlapping systems, that what happens far away can matter here, and that relationships can extend beyond immediate sight. On Pangaea, that idea had room to grow along every path that feet were willing to walk. Long before stories were etched into clay, carved into stone, or printed onto paper, they lived only where voices carried them. They traveled when people did. They altered themselves slightly at each retelling, the way a river changes its banks. And above them all, constant and patient, stretched the same sky. On a single, continuous land, myths, stars, and stories did not belong tightly to single, fenced-off cultures. They belonged to patterns that repeated across space, night after night, season after season, life after life. Human imagination layered itself over the sky because the sky was the one map everyone shared. Under Pangaea, the sky would have been the most stable thing in most lives. Ground shifted in slower, more subtle ways. Rivers meandered, coastlines crept, forests grew and burned, deserts advanced and retreated. But the stars returned, reliably, along their paths. For early storytellers, this regularity mattered deeply. When your world feels unpredictable, anything that repeats becomes a candidate for meaning. Looking up was practical first. The sun's height and path tell you the time of day and time of year. The moon influences tides and animal behavior. Stars, in the absence of artificial light, are bright and numerous enough to act as precise markers of direction, of season, of latitude. Wanderers under open skies quickly learn to use them. In a land without vast oceans carving populations apart, observations of the sky could diffuse widely. People living far apart would still watch familiar constellations rise and set. They might give them different names, clothe them in different stories, but they would be working from a similar visual script. A bright pattern near the horizon just before dawn might be tied to the coming of rains in multiple regions, each with its own local shading. Without writing, memory needs anchors. The sky provides them for free. Attach a story to a constellation, and every time that constellation appears, the story is invited back into the mind. A cluster of stars becomes a hero's belt, a wandering animal, a boat, a tree, a doorway to another realm. The specific form differs. The function helping people remember the relationship between celestial cycles and earthly events remains. Over a supercontinent, this creates a kind of shared, informal calendar. When those stars first appear at dusk, it will soon be time to move. When that bright wanderer stands near the horns of that animal, the rivers will flood. Such associations develop independently in many places, but because the underlying sky is common, the narrative structures that arise to explain them often rhyme with one another. Myths do more than mark time. They explain the unfamiliar. On a land that seems endless, people regularly encounter landscapes they've never seen before. Mountains that look like sleeping animals, rock formations that resemble faces, valleys carved by sudden floods. Myths weave these phenomena into understandable patterns. A dangerous canyon might be said to be the path of an angry spirit. A treacherous swamp becomes the footprint of a fallen sky being. A mountain that smokes from time to time is the home of a restless fire creature. These stories serve dual roles. They satisfy the urge to explain, and they encode caution. A child who hears about a vengeful spirit in a certain valley is less likely to wander there unprepared. Under one sky, myths can travel farther than the people who first told them. A story about a great flood may have started as recollection of a river bursting its banks on Pangaea or on one of its descendant landmasses. As that story moves from group to group, it may merge with other flood experiences, slowly becoming a generalized tale of water rising against land and erasing the familiar. When continents finally drift well apart and seas stand between them, these flood myths still echo in widely separated cultures. They are not geological reports. They are human-scale compressions of events that, in reality, unfolded over generations. Coastlines creeping inland, river mouths shifting, lowlands drowning. In story, these drawn-out changes become single floods. The sky also shapes how people imagine beginnings and endings. On a world where land is continuous, origin stories may emphasize emergence not from one sacred point, but from the land and sky together. Humans are made of earth and breath, or they come from ancestors who walked down from the stars and spread out. The idea of a chosen, isolated homeland cut off from all others is less intuitive when the ground beneath your feet seems to go on forever. Journey myths, in this environment, take on special importance. Heroes do not merely conquer or defend. They travel. They cross plains, ascend mountains, ford rivers, and pass through other people's territories. Along the way, they learn, transform, gather companions, and leave knowledge behind. These tales mirror the actual experience of living on a land where movement is chief among survival strategies. Death itself might be pictured as another journey. Under a shared sky where stars seem to rise from one horizon and sink beyond another, it is easy to imagine the dead walking along some cosmic route, up into the lights, down beneath the ground, along a river of stars. The afterlife could be not a fixed location, but an ongoing motion. Because the sky is visible to everyone, it acts as a kind of cosmic commons. No one owns the stars. They force sharing. People from different bands, seeing the same unusual event, a comet, a meteor shower, an eclipse, may interpret it differently, but they are still reacting to the same spectacle. This global, or at least continental synchronization of attention is rare for anything on the ground. As continents separate, that shared ceiling remains. A person looking at Orion from Africa and a person looking at Orion from what will become South America are seeing the same structure, offset slightly, under different weather and culture. Their myths diverge, but their pattern recognition is rooted in the same arrangement. This goes some way toward explaining why so many cultures, separated by oceans they had no knowledge of crossing, created similar mythic motifs around constellations and sky events. A hunter-like figure striding across the night, a serpent or river of stars, a central band marking a cosmic tree or path. The patterns invite such associations, and the human brain, wherever it is, tends to answer. Firelight strengthens this intertwining of myth and sky. At night, under the stars, people gather around flames that cast shifting light and shadow on faces and nearby rocks. The sky above is steady. The fire below flickers. Stories bridge the two. Lightning brings fire. Stars are campfires of beings above. The sun is a great ember carried across the sky. Children fall asleep listening to tales that knot together what they can see. the moon, the Milky Way, the glow of the horizon, and what they feel but cannot name: awe, fear, trust, longing. In this way, myths become emotional maps as well as practical ones. They help people cope with uncertainty and mortality by fitting them into a larger, semi-ordered picture. As Pangaea tears itself into separate continents and water occupies the gaps, the land-based routes that once allowed myths to travel start to vanish. Stories become more enclosed. They anchor more tightly to local landmarks: this mountain, this river, this sea. Some old traveling myths survive in altered form. Others mutate beyond recognition or are lost. Yet the sky remains one of the last shared languages. For as long as different cultures can see similar stars, there's a thin, invisible thread between their mythologies. They may never meet. Their words may be unintelligible to one another, but they are solving similar imaginative problems with the same reference points overhead. Even today, in a technologically linked but physically divided world, we can still feel the residue of that earlier unified relationship with the sky. We build telescopes, we name exoplanets, we tell science fiction stories about traveling among the stars. Many of these tales replay old mythic patterns in new vocabulary. The hero's journey becomes a space voyage. The underworld becomes a black hole or another dimension. The world tree becomes a cosmic web of galaxies. This continuity suggests that the deep structure of our storytelling was set long ago, under conditions where the sky served as the one constant frame for life on a connected land. Myths did not begin as attempts to escape reality. They began as attempts to align emotion, memory, and survival with a world whose rhythms were larger than any one lifetime. As the ground changed shape, the sky did not. The contrast between the two shifting earth, steady heavens likely influenced many cosmologies. The heavens came to represent permanence, truth, or order. The earth became the realm of change, struggle, and impermanence. This split appears in religious and philosophical systems across continents. It may trace back in part to the experience of watching a supercontinent slowly, inexorably, come apart under a largely unchanged sky. In that sense, myths, stars, and stories under one sky form a kind of deep, shared inheritance. They carry hints of a time when the planet's surface made it easier for ideas to move, when land did not insist on distance quite so fiercely. And even as we now live on a fractured map, that old experience still hums underneath our fascination with the night, our urge to tell stories, and our feeling that, somehow, the world is meant to make sense as a whole. At first, when the ground begins to drift apart, nothing appears dramatic from the surface. Plates do not crack open overnight. Seas do not roar in with theatrical speed. Instead, the change arrives as inconvenience and ambiguity. A river takes a slightly different route than it used to. A familiar valley seems wetter, holding ponds and marsh where firm ground once was. A seasonal floodplain stays flooded a little longer each year. The general shape of the land still looks the same to the casual eye, but its behavior is subtly different. For people living there, this is unsettling precisely because it is not immediately catastrophic. There is no single obvious moment to point to and say, this is when everything changed. Instead, dozens of tiny shifts nibble away at reliability. A path that used to be the straightforward choice now feels less certain. A favorite camp becomes muddy more often. A crossing once always safe now fails in some years. Beneath all this, at scales no one can directly perceive, tectonic forces are rebalancing. The thick cluster of continental crust that made up Pangaea traps heat in the mantle below. Flows of semi-solid rock adjust. Stress builds along ancient weakness zones. Very slowly, the continent begins to stretch in some regions and compress in others. Where it stretches, the crust thins and subsides. Long, broad depressions appear, rift valleys. At first, they are just lowlands. Rivers begin to redirect, choosing these easier paths downhill. Water collects, forming lakes where there were none, or enlarging existing basins. Some of these new water bodies are fresh, fed by rainfall and streams, and host flourishing new ecosystems along their shores. To people on the ground, this may look for a time like blessing. More water means more plants, more animals, more stable access to resources. New fishing opportunities arise. Birds gather. Certain plants that prefer wet conditions appear for the first time. Groups may shift their seasonal routes to take advantage of these new wetlands, spending longer near them. But as these rifts deepen, some will eventually connect to the surrounding ocean. The first salty intrusions might be slight, mixing subtly with fresh water, changing plant and animal communities in ways that are felt before they are fully understood. Fish disappear. New marine species arrive. Water levels and currents become more responsive to tides and distant storms. The land is still technically continuous, but psychologically something has altered. Where there was once only land between 2 points, there is now a widening stretch of unstable, waterlogged, or briny terrain. Crossing it is no longer a routine part of seasonal movement. It becomes a calculated risk. As rifts widen further, the climate reacts. New bodies of water change humidity and wind patterns. Rainfall regimes reconfigure. Areas that were dry begin to see more frequent storms. Others lose moisture as their supply routes of air are redirected. Old timing cues linked to specific winds or cloud patterns become less reliable. Groups relying on fine-tuned calendars start to experience more misses. The rains come late. The cold lasts longer. Animals shift their migration routes or timing in response. Reliable patches of land for grazing, gathering, or hunting move or shrink. The elaborate dance between people, climate, plants, and animals must be relearned in real time. Knowledge built over many generations begins to fray at the edges. Elders remember a world that worked one way. Youth grow up in a world that behaves another way. Both are right about what they've seen, but the ground is no longer obeying the same rules. Some groups respond by doubling down on what they know, clinging to familiar routes and practices even as returns diminish. Others experiment, trying new paths, adjusting timing, staying in one place longer, or moving away from increasingly unpredictable zones. Over time, these different strategies produce different futures. Where rifts deepen into true branches of the sea, the mental map of the world shifts. What was once a crossland becomes on the other side of the water. Short crossings in shallow, calm sections may still be possible with simple rafts or floating devices. Storms and currents make such attempts risky, but not impossible. In some regions, early maritime skill may emerge here, out of necessity and curiosity. But water is a different kind of barrier. It demands new tools and knowledge to cross. Those who lack or avoid these tools find their effective world shrinking. Paths that used to reconnect them with far-off groups simply end in surf. Meetings that once happened seasonally become rare or cease altogether. Information flows slow, then stop. This is how civilizations begin to separate long before they are fully distinct. The old expectation that given enough time and effort, you can always reconnect by walking fails more often. People wait for others who never appear. Stories of distant relatives and trading partners turn into stories of ancestors. Over a few centuries, those turn into myths of the people from beyond the water, rather than recent memory. As the land splits, practices like agriculture become more advantageous in some regions. When it's no longer easy to move elsewhere, in search of better conditions, it becomes rational to invest more deeply in altering a specific place to support you. Clearing, planting, storing, managing water. Settlements thicken around especially valuable stable zones. The effort and knowledge needed to maintain these zones deepen. Borders, in a more formal sense, begin as coastlines and as the edges of cultivable land. They are not policed lines at first, but practical ones. Beyond this line, we cannot easily grow enough. Beyond that shoreline, we cannot walk. Over time, as populations grow and land use intensifies, these practical boundaries harden into social and political ones. All the while, the sky overhead stays mostly unchanged. The same stars rise. The same constellations track the seasons. This contrast familiar sky, transforming ground can push thinking in new directions. People may begin to divide their understanding of reality into an unchanging realm above and a shifting realm below. That split can later feed into religious and philosophical dualities: heaven and earth, order and chaos, eternal and temporary. As oceans widen fully between land fragments, the cost of maintaining old connections skyrockets. Long sea voyages require substantial investment: better boats, navigation methods, cooperative crews, surplus to support those who aren't directly gathering food. Not every region or culture will pursue that path. Many will turn inward, elaborating local solutions, rich but increasingly distinct from solutions elsewhere. What began as slow-growing cracks within a single world becomes, over a long arc of time, the creation of multiple worlds of experience. Civilizations arise within these separated theaters, each solving similar problems under slightly different rules. From a distance, with enough time, we look back and see them as separate. But at the hinge moment, when rifts first became seas and paths first ended at water, the separation began, not with violence or choice, but with a quiet geological reconfiguration that no one generation could fully comprehend. Yet even after the ground chose its new shape, the memory of having once lived on a more continuous Earth did not vanish completely. It lingered as stories of lost paths, drowned lands, and people who used to come from the horizon but no longer do. It lingered in myths of floods and separations. It lingered too in a persistent human intuition that the divisions we now take for granted are not the only way the world can be. In that sense, when the ground begins to drift apart, it doesn't just move rock, it moves the underlying logic of human life from one built around connection through motion to one built around connection through stability, storage, and structure. And that slow, nearly invisible shift set the stage for everything we would later call civilization. When civilizations are pulled apart by a moving Earth, the separation does not begin with ships setting sail in opposite directions or with armies drawing lines in the sand. It begins with absence, with expected presences failing to appear, with silence in places where conversation used to live. For a long time, humanity carried an implicit assumption that if you keep walking long enough, if you follow the right river, pass the right mountain, and listen to the right stories, you can meet those who live far away. That assumption made the world feel connected even without any concept of global. It made distance feel like effort, not impossibility. As land masses drift and seas widen between them, the first thing to weaken is that assumption. Long before people think of themselves as belonging to different civilizations, they experience a subtler shift. A group travels to a seasonal meeting ground and finds no one there. They wait. They tell themselves the others are delayed. After some days or weeks, they leave, unsettled. Maybe they try again the next year. Maybe they send a small party farther along the old route to search. They encounter flooded lowlands, new inlets, deeper waters, or simply more difficult terrain. They return with incomplete news. We could not find them. Or, the path is no longer as it was. Over a few generations, these failures accumulate. Gathering sites fall quiet. Trade paths are remembered but no longer walked. The edges of the known world contract, not because land disappeared overnight, but because confidence did. By the time oceans stand clearly between former neighbors, most people living on each side have grown up without first-hand knowledge of the others. What remains is story. Our ancestors once came from over there. Or, people beyond that horizon used to visit. Those stories slowly drift from report to legend, then from legend to half-remembered myth. Meanwhile, within each increasingly separate region, the pressures of a more constrained geography begin to sculpt new social forms. When you cannot easily leave a troubled area to find a better one, problems that movement used to solve must now be solved in place. If floods threaten your crops, you cannot simply move the entire community to a distant but fertile valley no one is using. That valley may no longer be reachable, or may be occupied by equally constrained neighbors. So you build embankments, you dig channels, you coordinate labor on a scale larger than a single family or band. You store food against lean years. You decide who gets water when it runs low. These new tasks encourage more formal organization. Someone must plan irrigation. Someone must settle disputes. Someone must remember agreements. Leadership, once situational and flexible, begins to solidify around control of key resources. Water, fertile soil, stored grain. Authority becomes less about knowing the land's roots and more about directing its transformation. Writing enters this picture not as an artistic flourish, but as a practical solution to a new vulnerability. When knowledge used to travel mainly with people, as long as people could move, information could be refreshed and corrected through direct contact. As movement slows and contacts thin, memory alone becomes fragile. Oral tradition is powerful, but it can be warped by local interests or die with a generation struck by disease or conflict. Inscribing marks on durable surfaces, clay, stone, bone, wood, allows agreements, transactions, myths, and genealogies to outlive any one person. Writing makes it possible to coordinate larger groups over longer spans of time. It helps maintain continuity when geography has removed the older continuity of shared paths. Architecture follows a similar logic. On a world where you may need to leave at any time, building heavy, permanent structures is a questionable investment. But when departure becomes hard or impossible, investing heavily in one place begins to make sense. You build not just for yourself, but for your descendants. Walls, storage rooms, temples, and monuments emerge as physical statements. We expect to be here for a long time. Law, too, thickens under these conditions. In mobile societies, some conflicts can be resolved by distance. If groups cannot agree, they part ways. When people are rooted in a limited area, walking away from conflict is less feasible. You must find a way to live together, or at least to negotiate stable arrangements. Codified rules, whether oral or written, become crucial for managing land use, inheritance, debt, and punishment. Because continents separate unevenly, different regions encounter these pressures in different sequences and intensities. Some areas, like broad river valleys with predictable flooding, become early centers of intensive agriculture and high population density. Others, with harsher or more variable conditions, remain mobile or semi-mobile longer. Still others specialize in connecting roles. Coastal and riverine communities that maintain trade between otherwise separated cultural zones. From our modern vantage, looking back at Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, early China, Mesoamerica, and others, we see distinct civilizations with their own scripts, architectures, and pantheons. But beneath these differences lie common structural questions they all had to answer. How do we store surplus? How do we organize labor? How do we record obligations? How do we justify authority? The similarities in their answers, granaries, priesthoods, kingships, legal codes, monumental architecture, are often explained by universal aspects of human psychology. That explanation is partly right, but the physical pulling apart of land also plays a role. When people in different regions are forced by geography into patterns of settlement and resource control, it is not surprising that they arrive at parallel institutional solutions. Separation reduces redundancy. In a more connected world, an innovation in one region can more easily spread outward, preventing the need for repeated independent invention. In a fragmented world, new ideas may appear in several places, but many die with the cultures that created them. Others take centuries or millennia to travel from one region to another, if they travel at all. This patchiness shapes the human story. Some areas leap ahead in certain techniques. Others develop rich, alternative paths that later vanish from the record. Progress, if we call it that, is uneven and fragile. Geography becomes a filter as much as a guide. Conflict within and between these emerging civilizations also transforms. When movement is constrained by water or other barriers, territory becomes more zero-sum. You cannot as easily diffuse population pressure by fanning out into new land. Fertile zones and key trade nodes acquire high strategic value. Fortifications rise. Warfare shifts from episodic clashes between groups that can move away from each other to more entrenched struggles over fixed assets. This does not mean that earlier, more mobile periods were peaceful. But it does mean that the logic of conflict changes. The stakes become tied to place. Conquest becomes not just the capture of people or goods, but of fields, canals, and cities that can anchor rule. At the same time, cooperation intensifies within these more bounded societies. Large-scale projects, temple complexes, city walls, irrigation networks, roads require coordination on a scale that earlier, looser bands did not attempt. Rituals and belief systems arise that help justify and sustain such coordination. Shared deities, ancestor cults, state myths of origin and destiny. As oceans widen and contact between distant civilizations becomes rare or sporadic, each develops in relative isolation. They domesticate different plants and animals, they choose different focal symbols, they solve problems with different emphasis. Yet, remarkably, certain deep patterns recur. Hierarchical structures, sacred centers, written records, codes of conduct, ideas of cosmic order. From a deep time perspective, these civilizations are like branches on a single tree whose trunk formed under Pangaea and its immediate successors. The branches grow apart, twist in different directions, and sometimes break. But they share an unseen root system, the long era when land was more connected, and when human strategies were tuned to that fact. Recognizing this doesn't diminish the distinctiveness or creativity of any particular civilization. It adds context. It shows that human trajectories are not just stories of internal success or failure, but also of adaptation to a slowly rearranging stage. Even now, when we speak of the rise and fall of civilizations, we often imagine their histories as largely self-contained, driven by their leaders, their choices, their internal dynamics. But if we look more closely, we see the fingerprints of earthquakes, droughts, changing coastlines, shifting rivers, and altered trade routes. Earth's tectonic and climatic restlessness keeps rewriting the conditions under which human institutions must operate. When we realize that civilizations were, in part, pulled apart by the same planetary motions that once fused the continents, our idea of separation softens. We stop seeing different cultures as entirely separate experiments and start seeing them as variations on shared themes, shaped by a moving, breathing Earth. From this vantage, civilization itself appears not as humanity's default state, but as one adaptation among several a way to maintain continuity and complexity when free. Large-scale movement is no longer the easiest option. Before, connection was preserved by walking. After, it is preserved by writing, laws, monuments, and memories rooted in places. Yet the reflex to connect did not disappear just because water stood in the way. People built boats. They learned the winds. They followed coastlines. They hopped along chains of islands. They recreated, in smaller, riskier ways, the broad connectivity that the supercontinent had once provided by default. In doing so, they carried with them an older inheritance, the expectation that land, and by extension, the human world, is meant to fit together somehow. That separation, however real, is not absolute, and that there is always, somewhere beyond the horizon, another shore, where someone else looks up at the same stars and wonders similar things. That sense that unity once existed and can, in some form, be approached again, threads quietly through myths of golden ages, lost lands, and reunions. It echoes in philosophical ideas of a common human origin, in religious notions of a time when gods and humans shared space more closely, and in modern efforts to see the planet as a single, interdependent system. Even if we never step foot on Pangaea, its long-vanished wholeness continues to shape our deepest intuitions about what it means for the world to be complete. Echoes of that supercontinent appear not only in stories, but in how we draw and interpret maps. For much of recorded history, people made maps not to capture exact proportions, but to tell a story about how space is structured. Many early world maps show land masses joined or clustered more tightly than they are in reality, as if the mapmaker's mind expected more connection than separation. Medieval European TO maps, for example, schematically arrange the world's known land as a unified disk, divided into 3 parts: Asia, Europe, and Africa, surrounded by a single ocean. They are not accurate geography by modern standards, but they express a sense that the world's habitable regions are linked, parts of one figure. Other traditions from different cultures likewise centered their own region as a hub and arranged other lands around it in rings or spokes. These cartographic choices may reflect cultural bias, but they also hint at a persistent intuition that the world should be graspable as a single entity, that its divisions are conceptual as much as physical. Even after more accurate mapping revealed the true separation of continents, certain visual details have continued to bother attentive observers. The way the bulge of Brazil seems to nestle into the indentation of West Africa, the corresponding rock layers and fossil distributions that match across now distant shores. Before plate tectonics, these coincidences invited speculation about former unions. When Alfred Wegener and others proposed continental drift in the early 20th century, the idea met resistance at first. But once evidence piled up, the concept that the continents had once been joined into Pangaea and earlier supercontinents became widely accepted. It did not shock people's imagination so much as satisfy it. The mental picture of land once fitting together like puzzle pieces matched both the evidence and a pre-existing cognitive hunch. Myths, too, often speak in terms that mirror tectonic reality, albeit in humanized form. Lands torn apart by angry gods, seas opened by divine weapons, mountains raised overnight, bridges swallowed by jealous waters. These tales do not record literal plate motions, but they condense generations of witnessing more modest changes: earthquakes, coastline shifts, islands appearing or disappearing, floods carving new channels. Flood myths, in particular, appear in an astonishing number of cultures. While no single myth can be straightforwardly mapped to a specific event, the overall pattern suggests that people repeatedly experienced and transmitted stories of land turning to water. Whether from sea level rise after ice ages, tsunamis, river floods, or subsiding coasts, the lived experience of terrestrial loss made a deep impression. As Pangaea broke apart and subsequent supercontinents followed their own cycles of assembly and dispersal, coastlines moved repeatedly. Low-lying land that once connected regions is now seabed. From the human perspective, these drownings would appear, on smaller scales, as catastrophic. Chunks of family memory, trade routes, and sacred sites would vanish. The stories that preserve those memories become, over time, the raw material for myths of lost continents and sunken cities. Modern popular culture and fringe theories have sometimes seized on these myths to argue for highly advanced, lost global civilizations. Archaeology, so far, does not support those narratives at the extreme scales imagined. But the emotional truth those stories are built from is real. People did lose worlds. They lost paths, coasts, and neighbors to water. They lost easy connection and had to reframe themselves as belonging to smaller, more isolated spaces. Our maps encode both what we know and how we feel about space. Projections that show the entire globe at once necessarily distort something's shape, area, distance, or direction. Choices about what to center, exaggerate, or shrink are not purely technical. They carry cultural and psychological meaning. In many common projections, oceans appear as vast, somewhat empty fields of blue that separate solid blocks of land. This visual framing reinforces a sense of division, yet alternative projections can reverse that emphasis, showing the ocean as the continuous medium and land as scattered. Each perspective tells a different story about what is central and what is peripheral. When we overlay tectonic reconstructions on modern maps, showing Pangaea and earlier supercontinents, we glimpse a deeper layer beneath our current political and cultural boundaries. Suddenly, Africa and South America press together. North America slides against Europe and North Africa, India tucks under Asia, Australia snugs up to Antarctica. The mental image reveals a kind of prehistoric unity. Looking at those reconstructions, many people feel an odd mix of familiarity and disorientation. Familiar, because the shapes seem to belong together. Disorienting, because our usual orientation of north, south, east, and west no longer feels stable. Continents have rotated, flipped, and shifted. This sensation hints at something important. that our sense of where things should be is not only learned from current geography, it may also be influenced by cognitive patterns shaped in environments where continuity of land was greater. We expect things to connect. When they don't, we feel compelled to explain why. In contemporary language, metaphors of connection dominate how we describe understanding and harmony. We speak of bridging divides, building connections, finding common ground, and closing gaps. Even reconciliation is framed in spatial terms. We want separate pieces to fit together, not merely coexist. These metaphors are not mere poetic flourishes. They reflect deep cognitive associations between physical continuity and social or intellectual wholeness. Associations that likely formed in part under conditions when much of the environment was more continuous. Science, in its own way, continues this pattern. Plate tectonics, biogeography, genetics, linguistics, and comparative mythology all seek links between scattered data. They look for underlying structures that reveal how things once fit together. The human drive to connect dots to unify is mirrored in how we approach knowledge. Remembering Pangaea, then, is not just about learning the outline of an ancient supercontinent. It is about recognizing that our species evolved its basic patterns of movement, cooperation, and imagination in a world where land, for long stretches, pulled us together more than it pushed us apart. The continents will continue their slow drift. Future supercontinents will rise and break again. Humanity's particular chapter may occupy only a small part of this tectonic drama, but the habits we carry, the instinct to connect, to narrate, to map, to reconcile pieces into a whole, are shaped by a deep history with adjoining Earth. And so, when we look at modern maps, trace coastlines, or listen to old stories of joined lands and separated peoples, we are, in a way, listening to faint reverberations, echoes of a planet that once held its ground together, and of a humanity that first learned what it meant to be itself on a world whose default setting was not distance, but connection. Remembering a world that still lives beneath our feet does not require elaborate imagination so much as a change in focus. The ground we stand on has never forgotten its own earlier shapes. It carries those shapes in the angles of mountain chains that once lay along collision zones, in the mirrored contours of coastlines facing each other across oceans, in the chemistry and age of rocks now separated by half a planet but originally formed side by side. When Pangaea broke apart, it did not vanish. It transformed. The pieces drifted, rotated, and collided with other fragments, but the crust itself remained. The same slabs of lithosphere that once formed one vast expanse now lie beneath several continents and the seabeds between them. The supercontinent is gone as a single surface, but not as material. When we send seismic waves through Earth and listen to their echoes, we are effectively reading folds, scars, and sutures left from those ancient unions and separations. When we map the ocean floor, we see mid-ocean ridges, the conveyor belts of new crust and deep trenches where plates sink. When we date rocks on opposite coasts of the Atlantic and find they share the same ages and histories, we are confirming that they were once neighbors. Our species has always lived in relation to this hidden architecture, whether we knew it or not. Soil forms from weathered rock. The fertility of a plain depends on what lies beneath and upstream. River paths follow structural weaknesses in crust, and ancient valleys carved when sea levels were lower or climates were different. Earthquakes, volcanoes, and mountain building events remind us, sometimes violently, that the ground is not static. We respond, consciously and unconsciously, to this deep structure. We build along rivers because water follows certain geological rules. We avoid or are forced to adapt to fault zones where shaking is common. We settle in volcanic regions because ash-rich soils are productive, even while accepting the long-term risk. Even when we are unaware of Pangaea as a concept, we are living in the space it prepared. To remember that world is not to long for its return. Humanity could not simply step backward into a supercontinent and remain unchanged. The conditions that shaped us then are not the conditions we inhabit now. Instead, remembering is about recognizing continuity, about understanding that our story is one chapter in a much longer planetary narrative. The Earth does not distinguish between human time and geological time. It moves according to its own internal heat and orbital circumstances. Plates will continue to drift centimeters per year, whether we watch or not. In another 200 million years, if the planet remains habitable, the continents may once again gather into a new supercontinent, sometimes called Pangaea Proxima or Amnesia or Nova Pangaea, depending on the model. From that far future vantage, our present arrangement of continents would look like just one more transitional phase between great unions. Unity and fragmentation are not permanent conditions. They are modes that Earth cycles through. Human memory, by contrast, is short. Even our longest-lasting structures, temples, pyramids, walls erode quickly compared to mountains. Written history covers only a sliver of time. Oral history stretches farther, but even the best-preserved traditional narratives rarely extend more than a few tens of thousands of years with clear detail. Yet within these constraints, our minds strain against the boundaries. We imagine deep pasts and far futures. We build timelines that run billions of years. We create models of supercontinents and climate phases that no human eye has seen. This imaginative reach did not emerge in a vacuum. It builds on older instincts, to look for patterns, to connect fragments, to ask, what came before this? Whenever we encounter a boundary. Those instincts were forged in part on a more connected Earth. When your ancestors could, at least in principle, walk great arcs of land, patterns became easier to observe on large scales. Herd movements, seasonal cycles, recurring sky events, and even slow ecological shifts could be tracked indirectly through stories passed along wide networks. The sense that things fit together, over distance and over time, became embedded in the way humans reasoned. As continents slid apart, that sense did not disappear. It adapted. Instead of being proven daily through wide-ranging contact, it persisted as an intuition. And when modern science eventually developed the tools to test it at the geological scale, that intuition found confirmation in plate tectonics. We live now in a world where connection is being reinvented by technology. Instant communication shrinks psychological distance even while physical barriers remain. We can send messages across oceans in fractions of a second, track storms globally, and view satellite images of plates and fault lines Pangaea once unified. In some ways, we are rebuilding, virtually, a kind of global continuity that was once physical. At the same time, new forms of fragmentation emerge: political, economic, informational. Borders still matter for movement. Access to resources and safety is uneven. Narratives about who belongs where and who is separate from whom shape decisions and conflicts. The Earth beneath us is moving on a timescale too slow to feel, while societies above it rearrange at dizzying speeds. In this context, remembering Pangaea becomes more than a geological curiosity. It becomes a lens. It reminds us that the divisions we treat as fixed are, in a larger view, temporary. Seas will not always be where they are. Mountains will erode. New ones will rise. Nations, languages, and institutions will appear and vanish. The only constant is change. And yet there is a deeper continuity inside that change. We can see that continuity in the way different peoples, separated by oceans, still tell stories with similar structures. We see it in parallel mythic motifs, in shared social instincts, in common emotional responses to loss, wonder, and danger. These similarities do not erase cultural specificity. They show that beneath our differences lies a shared inheritance shaped on older, more joined ground. We can also see continuity in how we respond to planetary challenges. When climate change is now faster and more strongly influenced by our own activity than in many past epochs, we reach, sometimes clumsily, for the same strategies that served us before. Movement, cooperation, knowledge sharing, reconfiguration of habit. The problems are larger, the stakes are higher, but the basic adaptive toolkit is old. To remember that a unified world still lives beneath our feet is to acknowledge that geography has never been neutral. It has always influenced which strategies seem natural, which stories seem believable, which relationships feel possible. It is also to accept humility. The ground we consider stable is part of a much longer and more powerful process than any human plan. Humility, in this sense, does not mean passivity. It means clarity about scale. We can change coastlines now through greenhouse emissions. We can excavate, dam, drill, and build on staggering scales. But we cannot stop plates from moving or mountains from wearing down. We are powerful within a band of time and impact. Beyond that, the planet resumes its older rhythms. Recognizing this can sharpen, not dull, our sense of responsibility. If our actions now will be layered into the same geological record that holds evidence of Pangaea, then what we do is not trivial. We are writing our chapter on top of chapters written by collisions, rifts, and long-vanished oceans. Future beings, if any exist, may read our layer as we read the Triassic and Jurassic. Remembering Pangaea also reframes belonging. It suggests that national or continental identity sits atop a much older planetary identity. We are, in a straightforward physical sense, children of the same crust. The land under all our feet, no matter the continent, was once part of one body. The fact that water separates us now is real, but not ultimate. Even at the personal level, this awareness can shift perspective. Standing on a beach looking out at the ocean, you might see not just an impassable gap, but a flooded valley, a seam between tectonic plates, a former connection. Hiking in the mountains, you might recognize their folded rock as an ancient suture where continents collided. Touching a stone, you might feel its age not as abstraction, but as evidence of a world utterly different from ours. In daily life, these realizations may seem distant from errands, work, and relationships, yet they can seep in quietly, softening the edges of certainty. The person across a border, speaking another language, living under different rules, is still walking on a piece of the same old land. The conflicts and agreements of the present unfold on top of that deeper continuity. As this exploration comes to a pause, not a final conclusion, one thought remains quietly at the center. The Earth we know is only one arrangement among many that have been and will be. The way we live now, settled, networked, sometimes divided, is one response among many that humans have tried and will try. Pangaea, as a place, is gone. Yet its imprint is everywhere. In rock, in fossil, in climate patterns, in the genetic and cultural pathways that spread species and stories across the globe. Its deepest echo, perhaps, is in our persistent sense that, even across great distance, the world is somehow one thing that we, scattered across the broken pieces of an ancient whole, still belong to a single, restless planet. Modern myths often feel like fragments, tied to particular cultures, narrowed to regional pantheons or belief systems. Yet when you look closely, many of them reach for something wider, as if they're straining toward a memory they can't quite name. Stories of lost lands, submerged worlds, ancient unities, and primal separations appear again and again, even among societies that have had no contact for many thousands of years. These stories are not literal accounts of Pangaea. They are not secretly accurate geological histories. Instead, they are responses, cultural and emotional, to a deep experience our species has carried. That once, the world felt more connected than it does now, and that something about that connection was broken. Flood myths are one of the clearest expressions of this. From Mesopotamia to the Indus region, from indigenous traditions in the Americas to Pacific Island narratives, we find tales of rising water erasing familiar ground, of people fleeing to higher places, of a few survivors rebuilding on altered land. We can explain many of these myths as responses to local floods, tsunamis, river changes, and sea level rise after ice ages. But when considered together, they also speak to a general experience. Land as something that can be lost. Connection as something that can drown. As Pangaea and later supercontinents broke apart, and as ice ages came and went, coastlines moved. Land bridges that once linked regions disappeared under rising seas. Wide, shallow shelves became bays and gulfs. To people living along these margins, the change was not a gradual map animation. It was a series of unsettling events. Storms eating more of the shore, fields salting over, paths becoming tidal flats, then channels, then open water. Memory compresses such drawn-out processes into single, dramatic episodes. Story turns centuries into a great flood. Maps, even before they became scientifically precise, echo this tension between continuity and separation. Many early world maps, whether European, Middle Eastern, Asian, or from other traditions, try less to depict exact coastlines and more to express a sense of wholeness. They often show a central land surrounded by encircling waters, or multiple land masses grouped closely together, hinting at unity even when details are wrong. It's easy to dismiss those images as ignorance, but they also reveal a desire to see Earth as a coherent shape, to fit scattered lands into a single system. Long before the theory of plate tectonics, people noticed that coastlines suggested former contact. Long before we had fossils to prove it, they suspected that what is now divided may once have been joined. Even the modern language we use, Old World and New World, contains an echo of separation and reconnection. These phrases reflect the European perspective of discovering the Americas, but also a deeper narrative pattern. Land once unknown, becoming known again. Fragments of a whole being brought back into conceptual contact. Contemporary fantasies about lost advanced civilizations often tap this same well. Though archaeological evidence does not support many of the grandest claims, the popularity of such ideas shows that people are drawn to the notion that something important was lost when the world changed shape. The specifics crystal technologies, vanished continents with impossible architecture, may be imaginative overlay. The core feeling that geography once allowed forms of connection and knowledge sharing we no longer enjoy is more grounded. Scientific reconstructions of Pangaea and earlier supercontinents, rendered in textbooks and documentaries, can trigger a surprising emotional response. Seeing the continents locked together wakes something up. Of course they fit. Of course they were once joined. That recognition is partly rational. We see the matching coastlines. But it also feels like something deeper than logic, as if our brains were always half expecting to see the world drawn that way. This might be because our cognitive habits were shaped in landscapes that, although not supercontinental in the strict paleogeographic sense, were more connected than today's. Land bridges, narrower seas, and closer continental clusters made walking and diffusion easier. The brain, evolving in those conditions, may have encoded a default expectation that distance is a slope, not a wall. Today, technology has allowed us to re-knit parts of what geology tore apart. Fiber optic cables lace the ocean floor. Satellites beam information around the globe. Air travel lets people change continents in hours. In some respects, we live in a new kind of functional supercontinent, one built of signals and systems instead of rock. Yet the old tensions remain. Oceans still matter physically. Political borders constrain movement. Economic divides echo geographic ones. In the midst of this, myths and maps continue to reflect an urge toward unity. World peace is an ideal, the planet seen from space as a single marble. International frameworks that attempt, however imperfectly, to treat Earth as one shared home. Echoes of Pangaea, then, persist in two intertwined ways. One is structural, in the arrangement of continents, in the distribution of species, in patterns of rock and mountain and coastline. The other is cognitive and cultural, in our persistent suspicion that the lines we draw are not ultimate, that separation is provisional, that beyond our borders there are others who are, in crucial ways, like us. Remembering a world that still lives beneath our feet asks us to hold both truths at once. The earth is divided, and it was once joined. We are many, and we share deep roots. Distance is real, and connection has a longer history. When we stand on a cliff and look out across the sea, when we run our hands over a piece of stone that was once buried under another continent's soil, when we listen to stories from cultures far from our own and find ourselves recognizing their shapes, we are feeling those echoes. They are not instructions, they are invitations. To see our current world not as a finished arrangement, but as one moment in a long sequence of joinings and partings. In the quiet of such recognition, The voice of the ancient earth becomes easier to hear. It does not speak in words. It speaks in patterns of rock, of river, of wind, of migration, of myth. It reminds us that the ground we walk has been many worlds before this one, and will be many again. It suggests that our deepest sense that the world ought to make sense as a whole, even when it appears broken, may be the oldest echo of all. Here, with Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, we have traced that sense through science and story, through supercontinents and civilizations, through skies and seas and shifting ground. Pangaea itself is gone, but the habits it fostered, the expectation of connection, the skill of adaptation, the impulse to remember remain, waiting beneath everything we build. Every time we draw maps, share stories, cross borders, or look up at the same stars from different continents, we are, without knowing it, in conversation with that lost, continuous land. And perhaps, if we listen closely enough, we can carry forward not just the memory of its shape, but the deeper lesson it whispers, that separation is never the beginning of the story, only a chapter. Connection came first.